When a desperate widow marches into a feed store and proposes marriage to a stranger, she has exactly 4 days to save everything she owns. But the quiet cattleman who says yes without hesitation is hiding something that could destroy them both. This is the story of Evelyn Mercer and Caleb Ryder, two damaged people who agreed to a loveless arrangement in the frozen mountains of Black Hollow, only to discover that some bonds can't be faked, even when survival depends on pretending. Stay until the end to see how their desperate gamble changed everything. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The bell above the feed store door didn't so much ring as shriek when Evelyn Mercer shoved it open against the January wind. Snow followed her inside, swirling across the worn floorboards in angry white eddies that made the two men standing by the grain sacks look up with identical expressions of surprise. She didn't care about the snow, didn't care about the mud caking the hem of her riding skirt, or the fact that her hair had come loose from its pins somewhere between the ranch and town. What she cared about was finding Caleb Ryder before her courage failed completely. He stood near the back wall, one hand resting on a 50-pound sack of oats, his weathered coat dusted with the kind of dirt that came from actual work, rather than the performative ranch managing that most of the wealthy landowners in Black Hollow preferred. His dark eyes found hers across the cluttered space, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite concern, but close enough that it made her throat tighten. "I need to speak with you," Evelyn said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Privately." The other man, Frank Morrison, who owned the lumber mill and enjoyed gossip more than his own wife, perked up immediately. "Now, Evelyn, if this is about those fence posts your daddy ordered before he passed, I can—" "It's not." She didn't look at him. Couldn't afford to break eye contact with Caleb, because if she did, she might lose her nerve entirely. "Mr. Ryder, please." Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he straightened, dusted his hands on his pants, and walked toward her with the unhurried gait of a man who'd learned long ago that rushing rarely solved anything. "Outside?" he asked quietly. "No." The word came out sharper than she meant. "Here is fine." Frank Morrison made a noise that might have been a cough or a laugh. Evelyn ignored him. She'd lived in Black Hollow her entire life, survived her mother's death when she was 12, nursed her father through the pneumonia that eventually killed him 3 months ago, and spent the last 90 days fighting off land grabbers, corrupt county officials, and men who thought a woman had no business running 200 acres alone. She was done caring what people thought. "There's a law," she said, and hated how her voice wavered. Territorial statute from 1867. "Women can inherit land, but if it's more than 100 acres and she's unmarried, the county can force a sale within 6 months of the previous owner's death." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, maybe. Or pity. She couldn't tell which, and it made her want to scream. "My father died November 2nd, she continued. "That gives me until May to either marry or lose half the ranch to county auction. Wade Holloway's already filed papers claiming first right of purchase." At the mention of Holloway's name, Caleb's mouth formed a thin line. Everyone in Black Hollow knew Wade Holloway. Wealthy, connected, and ruthless in ways that made even the hardest ranchers nervous. He owned the largest spread in the territory, and he'd been trying to buy out the Mercer land since before Evelyn's father got sick. "I won't let him have it," Evelyn said. The words came out quieter now, but no less fierce. "I can't." Frank Morrison had given up any pretense of minding his own business. He stood near the grain sacks with his mouth slightly open, watching them like they were a stage play put on for his personal entertainment. Caleb glanced at him, then back at Evelyn. "What are you asking?" She'd practiced this part, rehearsed it a dozen times while riding into town, playing out different versions of the conversation in her head. But now, standing in the dusty warmth of the feed store with her heart hammering against her ribs, all those careful words vanished. "Marry me," she said. The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Frank Morrison actually gasped. Caleb stared at her, his face unreadable. "It wouldn't be real," Evelyn continued quickly, desperately. "Just a legal arrangement. We'd file the papers, add your name to the deed, and once the 6 months are up, we could dissolve it, annul it, whatever needs to happen." "You're serious?" It wasn't a question. Caleb's voice remained steady, almost carefully neutral. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." "You don't even know me." I know enough. And she did, in the way that small towns forced you to know everyone whether you wanted to or not. Caleb Ryder had arrived in Black Hollow 4 years ago with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and enough money to lease a small cabin on the far edge of town. He ran cattle on rented grazing land, kept to himself, and had a reputation for being quiet to the point of unsociable. He also had a reputation for honesty, which in a town like Black Hollow was rarer than gold. "You know I'm not looking for a wife," Caleb said, "and I'm not looking for a husband. That's the point." Frank Morrison finally found his voice. "Evelyn Mercer, you can't just... This is highly irregular. What would your father say?" "My father is dead." She said it flatly, without emotion, because if she let herself feel anything right now, she'd fall apart. "And his opinions don't matter anymore. But there are proper ways to... There's no time for proper." Evelyn turned back to Caleb, and for the first time since entering the feed store, she let him see past the brittle armor she'd been wearing for months. "I'm asking because I'm out of options. Holloway's got half the county officials in his pocket. If I try to fight this alone, I'll lose. The law is clear. I need a husband or I need to sell." "Why me?" Caleb asked quietly. It was the question she'd been dreading because the honest answer made her feel uncomfortably vulnerable. "Because you're the only man in this town who's never looked at my land like it's something to take," she said. "And because I think you might actually keep your word if you gave it." Something shifted in Caleb's expression then. A crack in that carefully maintained neutrality. He studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn forced herself to hold his gaze, even though every instinct screamed to look away. "When?" he finally asked. Her heart lurched. "When what?" "When would you want to do this?" You're actually considering it." I asked when. Evelyn's mind raced. "The county clerk's office is open until Friday. We'd need to file the marriage certificate before they close for the week and then record the deed transfer on Monday." 4 days. "Yes." Caleb was quiet for another moment. Then he did something that caught her completely off guard. He smiled. It was small, barely there, but unmistakably genuine. "All right," he said. Frank Morrison made a strangled sound. "All right? Caleb, you can't just agree to marry someone in a feed store." "Why not?" Caleb's eyes never left Evelyn's face. "Seems as good a place as any." "This is insane," Frank sputtered. "Both of you have lost your minds." "Probably," Caleb agreed mildly. He extended his hand toward Evelyn. "I'll need to settle some things with my current lease, but I can be ready by Friday." Evelyn stared at his outstretched hand. Calloused, scarred across the knuckles, dirt permanently embedded in the creases of his palm. It was the hand of someone who understood hard work in a way that the gentleman ranchers like Wade Holloway never would. She shook it. His grip was firm, steady, and somehow that simple contact steadied something inside her that had been shaking for months. "Friday, then," she said. "Friday." They stood there for a heartbeat longer, hands clasped, while Frank Morrison looked like he might faint from the scandal of it all. Then Caleb released her hand and stepped back. "I'll come by the ranch tomorrow. We should probably discuss the details before we do this." "Tomorrow?" "Yes." Evelyn's voice sounded distant to her own ears, like she was listening to someone else speak. "Afternoon would be best. I have cattle to move in the morning." "Afternoon, then." She nodded, suddenly desperate to escape before the reality of what she'd just done could fully sink in. Without another word to either man, Evelyn turned and walked back out into the January cold. The wind hit her like a physical blow, but she barely felt it. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of having actually done it. She'd proposed to a man she barely knew in the middle of a feed store with the town's biggest gossip as a witness. By nightfall, everyone in Black Hollow would know. By morning, the speculation would be unbearable. She didn't care. Let them talk. Let them whisper and judge and make up whatever stories they wanted. None of it mattered as long as she saved the ranch. Evelyn untied her horse from the hitching post and swung into the saddle with practiced ease. As she turned the mare toward home, she caught a glimpse of Caleb through the feed store window. He was standing exactly where she'd left him, watching her ride away with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between concern and calculation, maybe. Or regret. Bekir. The ranch looked different when Evelyn rode back through the main gate. Smaller, somehow, though nothing about it had physically changed since she'd left that morning. The house still sat solid and weathered at the end of the long drive, smoke curling from the chimney where she'd banked the fire before leaving. The barn still leaned slightly to the left, a problem her father had meant to fix before he got sick. The cattle still dotted the winter pasture beyond the fence line, dark shapes against the snow. But knowing that in 4 days all of this would legally belong to her and Caleb Ryder changed something fundamental about how it felt. She took care of her horse first, unsaddling and brushing her down with methodical attention that helped quiet the chaos in her mind. The barn was cold but familiar, smelling of hay and leather, and the particular mustiness that all barns seem to develop over time. Her father had built this structure with his own hands 30 years ago, before Evelyn was born. He'd repaired it, expanded it, and maintained it through decades of hard winters and brutal summers. And now she was gambling it all on a marriage to a stranger. "You'd probably tell me I'm crazy," Evelyn said aloud. Her voice echoed slightly in the empty barn. "You'd say there has to be another way." But there wasn't. She'd spent 3 months searching for alternatives. She'd consulted with lawyers in the county seat, the ones who weren't already bought and paid for by Wade Holloway anyway. She'd researched every possible loophole in the territorial statutes. She'd even considered selling part of the land voluntarily, just enough to get under the 100-acre threshold. Nothing worked. The law was clear, and Holloway had made sure every potential exit was blocked. Marriage was the only option left. Evelyn finished with the horse and headed toward the house. The kitchen was still warm from the morning fire, and she added wood without really thinking about it. Muscle memory from years of living alone, of taking care of everything herself because there was no one else to do it. Except now there would be. In 4 days, Caleb Ryder would live here, sleep here, eat meals at her father's old table, move through these rooms like he had some right to them. The thought made her feel vaguely nauseous. She'd told him it wouldn't be real, and she meant it. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. They'd share a house because the law required it, but that didn't mean she had to share anything else. He could have the spare bedroom, the one that still smelled faintly of the lavender her mother used to keep in sachets. They could live like roommates sharing space, polite but separate. She could survive that. She'd survived worse. Evelyn made coffee more out of habit than desire and sat at the kitchen table with the mug warming her hands. Through the window, she could see the sun starting its descent toward the western ridge. In a few hours, darkness would settle over the valley like a blanket, and she'd be alone with nothing but her thoughts and the howling wind for company. She was used to it, had been alone since her father died. Hell, had been functionally alone even before that, during those last awful months when he was too sick to do more than sit by the fire and cough into his handkerchief. But tonight, the solitude felt different, heavier, because tomorrow, Caleb Ryder would ride up to this house, and they'd have to figure out exactly what they were agreeing to. The details, he'd called them. Evelyn had no idea what those details should include. She'd never been married, had never even seriously considered it. Most of the men in Black Hollow had either dismissed her as too difficult or been intimidated by the fact that she could outwork, outride, and outshoot most of them. The few who'd tried courting her had given up when they realized she had no interest in being someone's decorative wife. She'd always been fine with that. Had preferred it, actually. But now she was about to marry Caleb Ryder in 4 days, and she couldn't even say for certain what color his eyes were. Brown, maybe? Or hazel? The realization made her laugh, a short, bitter sound that echoed wrong in the empty kitchen. She was marrying a man whose eye color she didn't know. Big sick. Caleb showed up the next afternoon exactly when he said he would. Evelyn heard the horse before she saw him, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats carrying across the frozen ground. She'd been in the barn checking on a pregnant heifer, and she emerged into the weak January sunlight with hay stuck to her sleeves and her hands still dirty from working. Not exactly how she'd imagined greeting her future husband, but then again, nothing about this situation matched any scenario she'd ever imagined. He rode a solid bay gelding, well cared for, but clearly a working animal rather than something kept for show. When he dismounted, the horse stood ground-tied without fuss, the mark of good training and patient handling. "Afternoon," Caleb said. His breath misted in the cold air. "Afternoon." Evelyn wiped her hands on her pants, realized it didn't help much, and gave up. "The heifer's looking good. Should drop her calf within the week. It was possibly the strangest greeting she'd ever given someone, but Caleb just nodded like discussing livestock with your future wife was perfectly normal. Mind if I put my horse up? Barn's open. He led the gelding inside, and Evelyn followed, suddenly hyper-aware of how the space must look to someone else. The tack room was organized but crowded, tools hanging from every available hook. The stalls were clean but showed their age, the wood worn smooth from decades of use. Her father's old saddle still hung in its usual spot, and seeing it made her chest tight. Caleb didn't comment on any of it. He just unsaddled his horse with efficient movements, brushed him down, and settled him in an empty stall with hay and water. "Nice setup," he said when he finished. "It works." They stood there for a moment in the dusty quiet, and Evelyn became acutely aware that she had no idea how to proceed. Should she invite him into the house? Offer coffee? Discuss their impending marriage in the barn like they were negotiating a cattle sale? Caleb solved the problem by speaking first. "We should probably talk through what this is going to look like." "Right, yes." Evelyn gestured toward the barn door. "House would be warmer." She led him across the yard and into the kitchen, intensely conscious of how small the space felt with someone else in it. Caleb was tall, not unusually so, but enough that he had to duck slightly under the door frame. He moved carefully, like someone used to being in places where he didn't quite belong. "Coffee?" Evelyn asked. "Sure." She busied herself with the pot, grateful for something to do with her hands. When she finally set 2 mugs on the table and sat down across from him, the silence felt thick enough to chew. "So," Caleb said eventually. 4 days. 4 days? Evelyn agreed. "We should probably establish some ground rule." The practical tone in his voice helped. This was business, just business. "What did you have in mind?" Caleb wrapped his hands around the mug, and Evelyn noticed the scars on his knuckles again. "First thing, sleeping arrangements. I assume you'll want me to take the spare room?" "Yes." He nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected. "Second, the ranch work. I'm not looking to take over what you've built here. You keep running things however you've been running them. I'll help where you need help, but this is your land." Something in Evelyn's chest loosened slightly. "All right. Third, money. I've got some savings, enough to cover my own expenses. I won't be a financial burden." "The ranch turns a profit," Evelyn said. It came out more defensive than she meant. "I can support both of us." "I'm not questioning that." Caleb's voice stayed level. "I'm just saying I pay my own way." They looked at each other across the table, and Evelyn tried to figure out what she was seeing in his expression. Not eagerness, definitely not that. Not reluctance either, exactly. Something closer to resignation, maybe, like he'd made a decision and was committed to following through regardless of how he felt about it. "Why did you say yes?" The question was out before Evelyn could stop it. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly. "You asked." "That's not a reason." "Isn't it? Most men would have said no. Hell, most men would have laughed me out of the feed store." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of the coffee mug. "You said you picked me because I don't look at your land with greed." "Yes." "Well, I said yes because you asked like someone who'd already exhausted every other option, and because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because Wade Holloway's a bastard, and I don't like the idea of him winning." It wasn't a declaration of love or even friendship, but somehow the blunt honesty of it made Evelyn trust him more than any pretty words could have. "He's going to fight this," she said. "When he finds out we're married, he'll challenge it, try to prove it's fraudulent. Let him try. I'm serious, Caleb. He has lawyers, connections, money, and we'll have a legal marriage certificate." Caleb met her eyes steadily. "Whatever his lawyers throw at us, we meet it head on. That's the only way this works." "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple. We get married, file the papers, and refuse to back down when Holloway pushes back." He paused. "He will push back, Evelyn. You know that." "I know. And when he does, we have to look like a real married couple, not two strangers sharing a house for legal convenience." The words hung in the air between them, and Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means if we're in town together, we act like a married couple would act. If someone asks questions, we have our story straight. If Holloway's lawyers start digging, they can't find anything that doesn't fit. You want us to lie. I want us to survive the scrutiny. Caleb's voice was firm, but not unkind. There's a difference. Evelyn knew he was right, but the thought of play-acting affection with a stranger made her skin crawl. I'm not good at pretending. Neither am I. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. We'll figure it out. They fell silent again. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Evelyn could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, a familiar sound that usually comforted her. Today it just reminded her how much she stood to lose. Friday, she said finally. County clerk's office. 10 in the morning? I'll be there. You should probably bring whatever belongings you want to move here. After we file the papers, it would look strange if you weren't living on the property. Caleb nodded. I don't have much. One trunk, some tools, my tack. The spare room has a bed and a dresser, not much else. That's more than I've had in most places. Another silence. Evelyn searched for something else to say, some other detail they needed to nail down, but her mind felt blank. This was insane. She was planning a marriage like it was a business merger, discussing sleeping arrangements and financial responsibilities with a man she'd spoken to maybe 3 times in 4 years. But insane or not, it was happening. I should go, Caleb said, pushing back from the table. Got cattle to check before dark. Right, of course. They walked back to the barn together, and Evelyn watched as he saddled his horse with the same efficient movements he'd used to unsaddle. Everything about the way Caleb moved suggested competence. Not flashy skill, but the kind of quiet capability that came from years of doing something until it became second nature. He swung into the saddle and looked down at her. Friday, then. Friday. Evelyn? He hesitated like he was deciding whether to say something. This is going to work, one way or another. She wanted to ask how he could possibly know that, what made him so certain, but the words stuck in her throat, and instead she just nodded. Caleb touched his hat in what might have been a goodbye, or might have been something more formal, then turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Evelyn stood in the cold and watched until he disappeared beyond the tree line. Then she went back inside and started making a list of everything that needed to happen in the next 4 days. The rumor spread through Black Hollow faster than Evelyn expected. By Thursday morning, she couldn't go into town without people staring. Some pretended to be subtle about it, quick glances followed by whispered conversations. Others were more direct. Martha Hopkins cornered her outside the general store. Evelyn Mercer, is it true what they're saying? You and Caleb Ryder? Depends on what they're saying, Evelyn replied, trying to edge past her. Martha blocked the path. She was 60 if she was a day, with steel gray hair and the kind of righteous indignation that came from a lifetime of minding other people's business. They're saying you proposed to him in the feed store with Frank Morrison right there watching. That's true. Martha's eyes went wide. So you admit it? Why would I deny it? Because it's, Martha floundered, searching for the right word. It's unseemly. A woman proposing, and to someone you barely know. Evelyn felt her patience, already worn thin by 3 days of speculation and judgment, finally snap. You know what's unseemly, Martha? Corrupt county officials using a 70-year-old law to steal land from widows. Wade Holloway bribing assessors to force sales. Men thinking they have the right to a woman's property just because she doesn't have a husband. Well, I did what I had to do to save my ranch. If that offends your sensibilities, I genuinely don't care. She pushed past Martha and into the general store before the older woman could respond. Inside, the conversation died the moment Evelyn entered. 3 women standing near the fabric display fell silent mid-sentence. The shopkeeper, old Mr. Patterson, suddenly became very interested in organizing the canned goods. Evelyn grabbed what she needed, flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition for the rifle, and brought it to the counter. Mr. Patterson rang it up without making eye contact. That'll be $4.30, he said quietly. Evelyn counted out the money, hyper-aware of the women whispering behind her. She caught fragments. Desperate. That poor man won't last 6 months. She took her purchases and left without saying another word. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Or maybe it was just that she had too much time to think, and thinking led to doubting, and doubting led to the terrible conviction that she'd made a massive mistake. What did she really know about Caleb Ryder? That he was quiet, kept to himself, and had a reputation for honesty. That was it. She didn't know where he came from, why he'd settled in Black Hollow, what he wanted from life beyond running cattle on leased land. And tomorrow she was going to marry him. The house felt oppressively empty when she got back. Evelyn put away the supplies and tried to focus on normal tasks, checking the cattle, repairing a section of fence that had come loose, mucking out stalls. Physical work usually helped quiet her mind, but today it just left her with too much space to spiral. What if this didn't work? What if Holloway's lawyers found some loophole, some way to prove the marriage was fraudulent? What if Caleb changed his mind at the last second and didn't show up tomorrow? What if he did show up and they got married and she'd tied herself legally to a stranger who turned out to be... Evelyn forced herself to stop. This kind of thinking wouldn't help anyone. She went inside as the sun was setting and made dinner she didn't want to eat. The kitchen felt too quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional pop of wood in the stove and the wind rattling the windows. She kept thinking about what Caleb had said, that after tomorrow he'd be living here, eating meals at this table, existing in this space she'd had to herself for months. The thought should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt complicated. She was washing dishes when she heard the horse. For a wild second, she thought it might be Caleb, coming to tell her he'd changed his mind. But when she looked out the window, she saw Wade Holloway's distinctive palomino tied at her gate. Her stomach dropped. Holloway was already halfway to the house by the time she got the door open. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from having money and knowing it gave him power. His coat probably cost more than most people in Black Hollow made in a month. "Evelyn," he said, touching his hat. "Hope I'm not intruding." "You are." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I heard some interesting news in town today. Thought I'd come see if it was true." "If you're here to congratulate me on my upcoming marriage, you can save your breath." "Upcoming marriage?" Holloway repeated the words slowly, like he was tasting them. "To Caleb Ryder, the cattleman who rents 40 acres from the Sullivan estate and lives in a cabin that's one hard winter away from collapse." "What's your point?" "My point is that this is a transparent attempt to circumvent the county sales statute, and we both know it." Evelyn crossed her arms. "The statute says I need a husband. I'm getting one. That's not circumventing, that's complying. You're marrying a man you don't love to keep land you can't manage alone. That's fraud, Evelyn. And when I prove it in court, you'll lose everything anyway. Get off my property." Holloway took a step closer. "I've tried to be reasonable with you. I've made you fair offers, more than fair. Your father would have taken the deal if he'd lived long enough to see sense. My father would have died before selling you an inch of this land." "Your father did die," Holloway said coldly. "And now you're about to lose his legacy because you're too stubborn to accept reality." Something hot and furious rose in Evelyn's chest. "The reality is that men like you think you can take whatever you want. Well, I'm not letting you have this ranch. Not through county sales, not through the courts, not ever. You think marrying some drifter is going to stop me?" Holloway's voice dropped lower, almost conversational. "I own half the county officials. I have lawyers who've never lost a case. When I'm done, you'll be lucky if I let you keep the house. You're threatening me on my own property. That's a bold move." "It's not a threat. It's a promise." Holloway turned to leave, then paused. "That wedding tomorrow? I'll be there. Want to see this farce for myself." He walked back to his horse, mounted smoothly, and rode off without another word. Evelyn stood on the porch until his silhouette disappeared into the gathering darkness. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with rage so intense it made her vision blur. Let him come to the wedding. Let him watch. Let him do whatever the hell he wanted. She was marrying Caleb Ryder tomorrow, and Wade Holloway could rot. Friday morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Evelyn woke before sunrise, too nervous to sleep, and spent the early hours doing chores with mechanical precision. She fed the cattle, checked the pregnant heifer, split firewood she didn't need just to have something to do with the energy buzzing under her skin. At 8 o'clock, she finally went inside to get ready. She didn't own a wedding dress, had never expected to need one. The best she could manage was a dark blue dress she usually saved for church. Simple, practical, without any of the frills or lace that women's magazines said were essential for brides. Looking at herself in the mirror, Evelyn felt vaguely ridiculous. This wasn't a real wedding. It was a legal maneuver. Dressing up for it felt like play acting, like she was a child putting on her mother's clothes and pretending to be grown. But appearances mattered. That's what Caleb had said. They had to look real. So she put on the blue dress, pinned her hair up properly for once, and even added the pearl earrings her mother had left her. When she looked in the mirror again, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked almost respectable, almost like someone getting married for the right reasons. Almost. Evelyn left the house at 9:30, giving herself plenty of time to ride into town. The county clerk's office was in the center of Black Hollow, a squat brick building that also housed the courthouse and the sheriff's office. A handful of people loitered on the steps. Whether coincidentally or because word of the wedding had spread, Evelyn couldn't tell. She tied her horse and climbed the steps with her chin up and her shoulders back. Let them stare, let them whisper, none of it mattered. Caleb was already inside, standing near the clerk's desk with his hat in his hands. He'd clearly made an effort, too. His shirt looked freshly washed, his hair was combed, and he'd shaved. The effect was startling. Without trail dust and stubble, he looked younger, more present, somehow. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them. Not affection, exactly. More like mutual recognition of how absurd this all was. "You came," Evelyn said. "Said I would." The county clerk, a thin man named Douglas Price, who'd held the position for 30 years, looked between them with obvious disapproval. "You're both certain about this?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Absolutely certain? Because marriage is a legal contract that shouldn't be entered into lightly." "We're certain," Caleb interrupted. His voice was polite but firm. "Can we proceed?" Price sighed and pulled out the necessary paperwork. "I'll need witnesses. Do you have anyone?" The door opened and Wade Holloway walked in. Evelyn's stomach clenched. He'd actually done it, actually showed up to watch her desperation play out in a county clerk's office. Holloway smiled at her, cold and satisfied. "Don't mind me, just here to observe a matter of public record." "You need to leave," Evelyn said. "Public building? Public record? I have every right to be here." Price looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Holloway, if you're going to stay, I'll have to ask you to remain quiet." "Miki si ichashit." Silent as the grave, Holloway promised, and settled himself in a chair against the wall like he was watching a particularly entertaining stage show. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He just moved slightly closer to Evelyn, a subtle shift that felt protective without being possessive. The door opened again, and Frank Morrison bustled in, followed by his wife Clara. "We came to witness," Frank announced. "Figured you'd need 2 people, and—" He noticed Holloway and stopped short. "Oh. Well, this is awkward." "It's fine," Evelyn said through gritted teeth. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, thank you for coming." Price looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "If everyone's ready, we'll begin. Miss Mercer, Mr. Ryder, please stand here." They stood side by side in front of the clerk's desk. Evelyn could feel Holloway's eyes on them, watching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. She forced herself to stand perfectly still, to keep her expression neutral. Price began reading from the marriage ceremony in a monotone that suggested he'd performed this ritual hundreds of times and found it no more interesting than filing tax documents. The words washed over Evelyn without really registering, something about lawful wedlock and sickness and health, and until death parted them. "All lies," she thought distantly. "Every word of this is a lie." "Do you, Evelyn Marie Mercer, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was watching her with those steady brown eyes. Definitely brown, she could see now in the office light, and his expression gave away nothing. "I do," she said. "And do you, Caleb James Ryder, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." Price closed the book with more force than necessary. "You may kiss if you'd like, but it's not required for the certificate." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb leaned in and pressed his lips to Evelyn's forehead. Brief, chaste, more like a brother than a husband. But it was enough. Behind them, Frank Morrison applauded weakly. Clara made a noise that might have been approval or might have been dismay. Wade Holloway said nothing, but when Evelyn glanced his direction, his expression had turned to stone. Price pushed the marriage certificate across the desk. Sign here, both of you, then your witnesses. Evelyn signed first, her hand steadier than she expected. Caleb signed next, his signature surprisingly neat for someone whose hands were scarred from ranch work. Frank and Clara added their names as witnesses, and just like that it was done. Evelyn Mercer was now Evelyn Ryder. The name sounded wrong in her head, foreign, like wearing someone else's boots. Congratulations, Price said flatly. File this with the property recorder on Monday if you're adding Mr. Ryder to any deeds. Next, they were being dismissed. Evelyn took the certificate, folded it carefully, and turned toward the door. Holloway stood as they approached. Well, he said softly. That was touching. Really, I'm sure the county judge will find it very interesting when we discuss the validity of this marriage in court. Go to hell, Evelyn replied, and walked past him into the cold morning air. Caleb followed her out, and they stood on the courthouse steps in silence while curious onlookers pretended not to watch. That went well, Caleb said eventually. Despite everything, the absurdity of the situation, the rage still burning from Holloway's presence, the unreality of having just married a near stranger, Evelyn laughed. It came out harsh and slightly unhinged, but it was genuine. We're insane, she said. Probably. They looked at each other, this man and woman who were now legally bound, and Evelyn felt the weight of what they'd just done settle over her like a heavy coat. I need to get back to the ranch, she said. The heifer. I'll follow you. Need to get my things anyway. Right. His things. Because now he lived there. Now he lived with her. The ride back felt surreal. Evelyn kept glancing over her shoulder to confirm Caleb was actually there, actually following her home like this was normal, like they hadn't just upended both their lives in a county clerk's office while Wade Holloway watched with predatory interest. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her with the afternoon chores without being asked. He moved through the work with easy competence, requiring no direction, no explanation. When he handled the pregnant heifer, he did it with the kind of gentle confidence that came from real experience, not book learning. By the time they finished, the sun was setting and Evelyn's exhaustion had caught up with her. I'll show you the spare room, she said. She led him upstairs, hyper-aware of their footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The spare room was at the end of the hall, small but serviceable. She'd put clean sheets on the bed yesterday and cleared out the dresser. It's not much, she said. It's fine. Caleb set his single trunk down with a soft thud. Thank you. They stood there awkwardly, husband and wife who barely knew each other until Evelyn couldn't take the silence anymore. I'm going to make dinner, she said. You hungry? Starving. They went back downstairs together, and Evelyn tried not to think about how strange it felt to have another person in the kitchen while she cooked. Caleb didn't hover or offer unwanted help. He just sat at the table and stayed quiet, which was somehow worse than conversation would have been. When the food was ready, they ate in near silence. Every scrape of fork on plate seemed too loud. Every swallow of coffee echoed. Finally, Caleb spoke. We did the right thing. Evelyn looked up. Did we? You saved your ranch. That's what you needed to do. I traded my freedom for it. So did I. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. But we both went into this with our eyes open. No one forced either of us. That was true. Whatever else this marriage was, it was voluntary. Holloway's going to fight, Evelyn said. He meant what he said about challenging it in court. Then we fight back. You make it sound simple. Fighting's always simple. Winning's the complicated part. Caleb finished his coffee and stood. I should let you rest. It's been a long day. He headed for the stairs, then paused at the doorway. Evelyn? Yes? For what it's worth, I don't regret saying yes. He disappeared upstairs before she could respond. Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the old house settle around her, and tried to figure out if she regretted it too. She didn't know, but it was too late to change her mind now. The first week passed in a strange blur of routine and adjustment. Evelyn woke before dawn each morning the way she always had. But now there were sounds in the house that didn't come from her. Boots on the stairs, water running, the creak of floorboards in the spare room. She'd lie in bed listening to Caleb move around downstairs, making coffee, banking the fire, and wonder what the hell she'd gotten herself into. He never waited for her. By the time she came down, he'd already be outside working, fixing the barn door that had been sticking since October, clearing snow from the path to the livestock pens, checking fence lines she'd been meaning to inspect for weeks. He moved through the work with quiet efficiency, never asking permission, never seeking praise. Just doing what needed doing. It should have annoyed her. This was her ranch, her responsibility. But instead she felt something uncomfortably close to relief. They spoke mostly about practical things. The pregnant heifer dropped her calf on Tuesday, a healthy bull that Caleb helped deliver at 2 a.m. when complications arose. They'd worked together in the freezing barn, Evelyn's hands slick with blood and birth fluids while Caleb held the heifer steady and murmured low reassurances that seemed to calm the frantic animal more than any of Evelyn's cursing did. When it was over and the calf was nursing, they'd stood side by side watching, both too tired to move. "First birth I've seen go sideways like that in a while," Caleb had said. "She's young. First calf. They panic." "You handled it well." Evelyn had looked at him then, this stranger she'd married, and felt the beginnings of something she couldn't quite name. Not trust exactly, but maybe the foundation of it. "Couldn't have managed without you holding her," she'd admitted. He just nodded like it was obvious he'd be there. They'd walked back to the house as the sky started lightening in the east, and Evelyn had made breakfast while Caleb cleaned up. They ate in tired silence, then both went to bed, to separate rooms, and slept until noon. It was the most domestic thing Evelyn had experienced in years, and it terrified her. On Monday, they rode into town together to file the deed transfer. Evelyn had expected more whispers, more judgment, but what she got instead was something worse, acceptance tinged with pity. People looked at her and Caleb like they were watching a slow-motion disaster, waiting to see how long the charade would last before it all fell apart. Martha Hopkins actually offered congratulations, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure you two will be very happy together, for as long as it lasts." Evelyn had smiled with too many teeth. "We'll outlast your last 3 cats, Martha." Caleb had coughed to cover what might have been a laugh. The property recorder, a nervous man named Thomas Green, processed their paperwork with shaking hands. "This all looks in order," he'd said, not meeting their eyes. "Deeds now in both names. Joint ownership." Joint ownership. The words made Evelyn's stomach clench, even though this was exactly what she'd planned for. Her father's land, her land, now legally belonged to her and Caleb Ryder equally. She'd signed away half of everything to save all of it. On the ride home, Caleb had been quiet, more quiet than usual, which was saying something. "You're thinking too loud," Evelyn finally said. "Just wondering when Holloway's going to make his move." "Soon. He's not the patient type." "Neither are you," Caleb observed. Evelyn glanced at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means you're waiting for the other boot to drop, expecting the worst." "The worst usually happens." Sometimes Caleb shifted in his saddle, but not always. They'd ridden the rest of the way in silence, and Evelyn had tried not to think about how strange it felt to have someone who could read her moods after only a week. By the end of February, they'd fallen into something that almost resembled a routine. Caleb took over the heavy repair work, things Evelyn had been putting off because they required 2 people or strength she didn't have. The barn door got fixed. The loose section of roof got patched. The water pump that had been sputtering all winter got torn down and rebuilt. In return, Evelyn managed the books, the cattle rotation, and the planning. She was better with numbers, better at seeing the big picture. Caleb never questioned her decisions about the ranch, never tried to override her judgment. He just did what she asked and offered suggestions when something seemed off. It shouldn't have worked. They were too different, too careful around each other. But somehow it did work, in the same way that a broken bone could heal stronger than before if you set it right. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. Black Hollow was too small for anything to go unnoticed. Evelyn heard the whispers when she went into the general store. How Caleb had been seen carrying her supplies, how they rode into town together now, how he stood close to her in public like he had some claim to make. People were starting to believe the marriage might actually be real, which was exactly what they needed, Evelyn reminded herself. They needed everyone to believe it, especially when Holloway's lawyers came calling. but the whispers still made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. One evening in early March, after a long day of moving cattle to fresh pasture, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the companionable silence that had become normal between them. Evelyn was going over the ranch accounts, Caleb was oiling a saddle, and the fire crackled quietly in the stove. "We should probably talk," Caleb said suddenly. Evelyn's pen stilled. Nothing good ever started with those words. "About what?" "About the fact that we're doing a terrible job of looking like a married couple. We're managing fine. We're managing like business partners. That's different." Caleb set down the leather oil and looked at her directly. "When we're in town, you stand 3 feet away from me like I've got something contagious. You flinch if I get too close. Yesterday at the feed store, Frank Morrison made a joke about newlyweds, and you looked like you wanted to crawl out of your skin." Heat crept up Evelyn's neck. "I don't flinch." "You do. Not obviously, but enough that people notice." His voice stayed gentle, which somehow made it worse. "If Holloway brings this to court, they're going to ask questions. Witnesses are going to testify, and right now, anyone watching us would say we barely tolerate each other. So what do you want me to do? Hang on you like some simpering—" "I want you to not jump like I've burned you when I touch your arm," Caleb interrupted quietly. "I want you to be able to stand next to me without looking like you're about to bolt. That's all." Evelyn stared at him across the table. He was right, and she hated it. She'd been so focused on the legal aspects of their arrangement that she'd forgotten about the human element. People didn't just look at paperwork, they looked at behavior, body language, the 1,000 tiny signals that separated real couples from fake ones. "I'm not good at pretending," she said finally. "I know, neither am I." Caleb hesitated. "But maybe we don't have to pretend. Maybe we just get used to each other. Enough that being close doesn't feel wrong. How do we do that?" He thought for a moment. "Start small. When we're in town tomorrow, let me help you with your horse. Let me stand next to you without putting distance between us. If someone makes a comment about us being married, don't look like you want to argue." "That's it?" "That's it. Nothing dramatic. Just stop acting like we're strangers." Caleb picked up the saddle leather again, his hands moving in steady circles. "We live together, Evelyn. We work together. We eat meals together. We're not strangers anymore, whether you want to admit it or not." The truth of it settled over her like snow, quiet, unavoidable, changing the landscape whether she liked it or not. "All right," she said. "I'll try. That's all I'm asking." They went back to their separate tasks, but something had shifted in the air between them. An acknowledgement of what they were building, even if neither of them wanted to examine it too closely. The next day, Evelyn made a conscious effort to relax when Caleb stood beside her at the blacksmith shop. When he reached past her to point out a section of ironwork, she didn't step away. When Tom Brady, the blacksmith, made a comment about married life, she managed a smile instead of a grimace. "You two settling in all right?" Tom asked, pumping the bellows. "Well enough," Caleb replied. "That's good. Real good." Tom glanced at Evelyn. "Your daddy would be glad to know the place is being looked after proper." The mention of her father made Evelyn's chest tight, but she forced herself to nod. "I think you would be." They left with new horseshoes and the strange sense that they'd passed some kind of test. Over the following weeks, the small adjustments added up. Caleb started sitting closer to her at the table. Evelyn stopped tensing when his hand brushed hers while passing tools. They moved around each other in the kitchen without the careful distance they'd maintained before. It was still strange, still awkward sometimes, but it was getting easier. Then the spring storms hit. The first one rolled in on a Tuesday evening, dark clouds gathering over the mountains with the kind of weight that promised violence. Evelyn spent the afternoon securing anything that might blow away, bringing the horses into the barn, making sure the cattle had access to shelter. Caleb worked alongside her without needing instruction. He'd been through enough mountain storms to know the routine. By the time they got inside, the wind was already howling and rain was starting to lash against the windows in horizontal sheets. Evelyn made coffee while Caleb built up the fire, both of them soaked and shivering. "Going to be a bad one," Caleb said, watching the storm through the kitchen window. Yeah, they'd barely dried off when the real violence started. Thunder that shook the house, lightning that turned the world white, wind that screamed through the eaves like something dying. The windows rattled in their frames, Somewhere outside, something metal was banging rhythmically against wood. "Barn door," Evelyn said, starting to stand. Caleb caught her wrist. "You're not going out there. If it tears loose, then it tears loose. We'll fix it tomorrow." His grip was firm, but not painful. "You go out in this, you'll get killed. I've been through worse storms. Not with someone here who gives a damn if you live or die." The words hung between them, raw and unexpected. Evelyn stared at him, at the hand still wrapped around her wrist, at the genuine concern in his expression. "Let go," she said quietly. He did, immediately, like her skin had burned him. Evelyn sat back down. The banging continued outside, irregular and maddening, but Caleb was right. Going out there would be stupid. They sat in tense silence while the storm raged. Every crack of thunder made Evelyn flinch despite herself. She'd never been afraid of storms, but the violence of this one was extraordinary, even for the mountains. Around midnight, when the worst of it seemed to be passing, Caleb spoke. "I had a wife. Before." Evelyn's head snapped up. "What?" "Back in Missouri. We were married 3 years before she died." His voice was flat, carefully controlled. "Fever took her and our daughter both, winter of '72. The information hit Evelyn like a physical blow. In all their careful negotiations, all their practical discussions, it had never occurred to her to ask if Caleb had been married before. She'd just assumed he was like her, alone by choice or circumstance. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "No, it doesn't." "Is that why you said yes? When I asked you to marry me?" "Part of it." He turned back to the window. "I told myself I'd never marry again. Swore it. But when you came into that feed store looking half desperate and fully terrified, I thought maybe it could be different if it wasn't real. If there were no expectations, no promises, no one to lose." "This isn't real," Evelyn said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "Isn't it?" Caleb's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "We share a house. We work the same land. We're building something together whether you want to admit it or not. What part of that isn't real?" Evelyn had no answer for that. The storm finally blew itself out around 2 a.m. When dawn broke, they surveyed the damage together. The barn door hanging by one hinge, several sections of fence down, debris scattered across the yard. It could have been worse, but it was bad enough. They spent 3 days repairing everything. Hard, exhausting work that left them both too tired for conversation. But working side by side in the aftermath of the storm, Evelyn started noticing things she'd been trying not to notice. The way Caleb moved, economical and precise. The quiet competence in everything he did. The fact that he never complained, never shirked, never looked for the easy way out. The fact that when he'd grabbed her wrist to keep her from going into the storm, her first instinct hadn't been anger at being restrained. It had been relief that someone cared enough to stop her. By the time everything was repaired, something had changed between them again. Evelyn couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but the careful distance they'd maintained was eroding faster than she knew how to handle. On Saturday, they rode into town for supplies. It was a clear day, the kind of bright spring morning that made winter feel like a bad dream. Black Hollow was busier than usual, people preparing for planting season, catching up on business they'd put off during the storms. Evelyn was loading sacks of feed into her wagon when she heard the voice she'd been dreading. "Mrs. Ryder, how domestic." She turned to find Wade Holloway leaning against the hitching post, watching her with that same predatory expression he'd worn at the courthouse. "Mr. Holloway." She kept her voice neutral. "I see your husband's put you to work." Holloway gestured toward the wagon. "Shouldn't he be doing the heavy lifting?" "I can manage." "I'm sure you can. You've always been remarkably capable." He pushed off from the post and walked closer. "Which is why this whole performance is so disappointing. I expected better from you, Evelyn." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." Holloway's smile was cold. "Tell me, does Ryder know what he's gotten himself into? That he's playing husband to a woman who'd sell her soul to keep a piece of dirt?" Anger flared hot in Evelyn's chest. "Careful. Or what? You'll have your pretend husband defend your honor?" Holloway laughed. "Everyone knows this marriage is a fraud. You're just counting down the days until you can divorce and divide the property." You don't know anything about my marriage. I know you're desperate. I know you used that poor man to save your precious ranch. Holloway leaned in close enough that she could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. And I know that when my lawyers are done, you'll wish you'd taken my original offer. Before Evelyn could respond, Caleb appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. Problem? His voice was quiet, but something in it made Holloway take a step back. Just having a friendly conversation with your wife. Didn't look friendly. We were discussing business, nothing that concerns you. Everything that concerns her concerns me. Caleb's hand found Evelyn's lower back, a casual touch that sent electricity up her spine. And I'd appreciate it if you'd step back. For a long moment, Holloway just stared at them. Then his mouth curved into something ugly. How much is she paying you, Ryder? To play the devoted husband? I'm not playing. Then you're an even bigger fool than I thought. Holloway tipped his hat mockingly toward Evelyn. See you in court, Mrs. Ryder. He walked away, and Evelyn realized she'd been holding her breath. You all right? Caleb's hand was still on her back, warm through the fabric of her shirt. Fine. You're shaking. She was. Damn it, she was. He makes me so angry I can't think straight. I noticed. Caleb's thumb moved in a small circle, probably unconsciously. What did he say before I got here? The usual. That our marriage is fake, that he's going to prove it in court, that I'm using you. Are you? Evelyn turned to look at him and found his expression impossible to read. What? Using me. Are you? We had an agreement. That's not what I asked. They stood there in the middle of town, people walking past and definitely noticing, while Evelyn tried to figure out how to answer a question she didn't fully understand herself. I don't know, she finally admitted. I don't know what this is anymore. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Yeah, me neither. He dropped his hand and helped her finish loading the wagon, and they rode home in silence that felt heavier than any words could have been. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her and trying to untangle the mess inside her head. 6 weeks ago, she'd proposed a business arrangement to a near stranger. A legal fiction to save her ranch. That's all it was supposed to be. But somewhere between then and now, things had gotten complicated. She trusted Caleb. That was the first problem. Trusted him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone since her father died. He'd proven himself reliable, honest, and genuinely committed to making their arrangement work. And more than that, she liked having him here, liked not being alone in the house at night, liked the way he made coffee in the mornings and left it warming on the stove for her, liked the quiet competence he brought to everything he did, which was dangerous because liking led to depending, and depending led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to the kind of pain she'd sworn she'd never let herself feel again. Around 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs for water. The kitchen was dark except for the dying embers in the stove, and she didn't bother lighting a lamp. Can't sleep either? Evelyn jumped, nearly dropping the cup. Caleb was sitting at the table in the darkness, just a shadow against the window. You scared me. Sorry. He didn't sound sorry. Storm? Evelyn listened. Sure enough, rain was starting to patter against the windows again. Nothing like the violence of the storm days ago, but steady and insistent. I didn't hear it start, she said. Just began. Caleb's face was barely visible in the dim light. What's keeping you up? Nothing. Everything. Evelyn filled her cup and leaned against the counter. What Holloway said today? About me using you. We both knew what this was when we started. Did we? The words came out more raw than she intended. Because I don't think I did. I thought I could treat this like a business deal, but people aren't cattle, Caleb finished quietly. They're messy and complicated, and they don't fit into neat arrangements no matter how much you want them to. Is that what happened with your first marriage? It was a bold question, maybe too bold, but the darkness made her brave. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, My first marriage was real. All the messy, complicated parts included, and when it ended, it nearly broke me. I'm sorry. Stop saying that. You didn't cause it. He shifted in his chair. You asked me once why I said yes to your proposal. The real answer is that I thought a fake marriage would be safer. No real emotions involved. No one to mourn if it all went wrong. And now? Now I'm not sure what this is anymore either. They sat in the darkness, listening to the rain. Two people who'd entered into an arrangement and discovered it was turning into something neither of them had planned for. I'm scared, Evelyn admitted, of what happens if this becomes real. Why? Because real things end. Real things get taken away. And I've already lost everyone I ever... Her voice cracked, and she stopped. Not everyone leaves, Caleb said quietly. Some people stay. Until they don't. Evelyn. He stood and crossed to where she was standing. In the faint light from the window, she could just make out his expression. I gave you my word when we made this arrangement. That word stands whether this marriage is fake or real or something in between. I'm not leaving. You can't promise that. I just did. She wanted to argue, to point out all the ways life could tear people apart regardless of promises. But standing there in the dark kitchen with rain drumming on the roof and Caleb close enough to touch, the arguments felt distant and unimportant. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. But maybe we figure it out together. His hand lingered against her cheek, warm and calloused and steady. Evelyn's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. Then she did something that surprised them both. She leaned into the touch instead of pulling away. Caleb's breath caught. For a long moment they just stood there, connected by that single point of contact while the rain fell and the old house creaked around them. I should go back to bed, Evelyn finally said, but she didn't move. Probably. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you. For staying. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone once, gentle and deliberate. Then he stepped back, breaking the contact. Always. Evelyn went back upstairs with her cup of water forgotten on the counter. She lay in bed listening to Caleb move around downstairs, then climbed the stairs to his own room. The house went quiet again except for the rain. But something fundamental had shifted between them, and they both knew it. The next morning they went back to work like nothing had happened. But Evelyn found herself watching Caleb more openly now. And when she caught him watching her back, neither of them looked away as quickly as they used to. 2 weeks later, the legal papers arrived. Evelyn was in the barn when Caleb came looking for her, an envelope in his hand and his expression grim. From Holloway's lawyers, he said, handing it over. Evelyn opened it with fingers that wanted to shake. The legal language was dense and deliberately intimidating, but the message was clear. Wade Holloway was filing a formal challenge to their marriage, claiming fraud and demanding an annulment. If successful, the deed transfer would be voided and the ranch would be subject to the county sales statute. There was a court date, 3 weeks away. Well, Evelyn said, staring at the papers, at least we knew it was coming. We'll fight it. With what? We don't have lawyers. We don't have money for lawyers. We have the truth. Evelyn laughed, the sound bitter. The truth is that I proposed to you in a feed store to save my ranch. That's exactly what they're going to prove. The truth, Caleb said firmly, is that we got married legally, that we've been living as husband and wife for 2 months, that whatever our reasons were at the start, we're building a real life together now. Are we? He looked at her directly. Aren't we? And that was the question, wasn't it? What were they building? What had this become in the weeks since that awkward courthouse ceremony? Evelyn thought about the way they moved around each other now, comfortable and familiar. The way Caleb had his own chair at the table, his own hook for his coat. The way she caught herself listening for his footsteps in the morning, relaxing when she heard them. The way her heart had jumped when he touched her face in the dark kitchen, and the way she'd spent every night since then thinking about it. I don't know how to prove that to a judge, she said quietly. Then we don't prove it. We just live it. Caleb took the papers from her hand and set them aside. Whatever happens in 3 weeks, we keep going the way we have been, together, and we trust that the truth is enough. Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that honesty and good intentions could stand against money and power and corrupt systems designed to crush people like her. But belief had never been her strong suit. Still, she nodded, because what else could she do? The 3 weeks before the hearing crawled by with excruciating slowness. Evelyn threw herself into ranch work with an intensity that bordered on reckless, pushing herself until exhaustion was the only thing that let her sleep at night. Caleb watched her burn herself out with quiet concern, but didn't try to stop her. He just worked beside her, matching her pace, picking up the pieces when she pushed too hard. On a Saturday morning 10 days before the court date, Evelyn was in the back pasture repairing fence when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses. She straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead, and saw 3 riders coming up the access road. Her stomach dropped when she recognized the lead rider. Wade Holloway sat astride his palomino like he owned the world. Behind him rode 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize, city types in expensive coats, probably the lawyers he'd been threatening her with for months. Caleb appeared from the barn, tools still in his hands. He moved to stand beside Evelyn without a word, his presence solid and reassuring. "Mr. Holloway," Evelyn called out, keeping her voice level, "you're trespassing." Holloway reined in his horse 20 feet away. Up close, his smile looked even more predatory. "Just wanted to introduce you to my legal counsel before we all meet in court. Thought it might help if we establish some ground rules. The only rule is that you're not welcome on my property." "Your property?" Holloway repeated the words like they were a joke. "That's the question we're going to settle, isn't it? Whether this land is really yours or whether you committed fraud to keep it." One of the lawyers, a thin man with spectacles and the pinched expression of someone who'd never done a day's physical labor, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ryder, my name is Howard Blackwell. I represent Mr. Holloway in this matter. I'd like to offer you an opportunity to avoid litigation entirely." "Not interested," Evelyn said flatly. "You haven't heard the offer yet." "Don't need to. The answer's no." Blackwell's mouth thinned. "Mr. Holloway is prepared to purchase the entire Mercer property for $15,000. That's well above market value, Mrs. Ryder. It's more than generous considering your circumstances." "My circumstances are that I'm married and this land isn't for sale." "Your marriage is exactly what we're questioning," the second lawyer interjected. He was younger than Blackwell, with slicked back hair and a superiority complex Evelyn could smell from yards away. "We have witnesses prepared to testify that you and Mr. Ryder barely knew each other before your sudden courthouse wedding, that you've been living as strangers sharing a house rather than husband and wife." Caleb's hand found Evelyn's, his fingers lacing through hers with deliberate casualness. "Witnesses can say whatever they want. Doesn't make it true." "We'll see what the judge thinks," the younger lawyer said smugly. "Annulment cases require proof of a genuine marriage. Can you provide that proof, Mr. Ryder?" "Can you prove it's not genuine?" Caleb countered. Holloway laughed. "This is entertaining, but ultimately pointless. Evelyn, you're going to lose. My lawyers have already documented inconsistencies in your story. We have testimony from multiple townspeople about your desperate proposal, your separate sleeping arrangements, the way you two barely tolerate each other in public." "Those people don't know anything about our marriage," Evelyn said. "Then enlighten us." Holloway leaned forward in his saddle. "Tell me one thing, one genuine thing, about your relationship with Caleb Ryder that proves this isn't exactly what it looks like. A desperate woman using a desperate situation to manipulate the law." Evelyn opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? That Caleb made coffee for her every morning? That he delivered a calf at 2 a.m. without complaint? That sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, and it made her heart do things she didn't want to examine? None of that would mean anything to these men. Before she could formulate an answer, Caleb spoke. "I know that my wife puts too much sugar in her coffee when she thinks no one's looking. I know she talks to the cattle like they're people and gets embarrassed when she realizes someone can hear her. I know she's terrified of losing this ranch because it's the last piece of her father she has left, and she'd rather die than admit she needs help carrying that weight." Evelyn's head snapped toward him, but Caleb kept his eyes on Holloway. "I know she works herself half to death rather than show weakness," he continued. "I know she's got a scar on her left hand from when she was 12 and tried to prove she could rope a steer as well as any boy in the county. I know she reads the same 3 books over and over because they were her mother's favorites. And I know she still sleeps on the right side of the bed, even though there's no one taking up the left." The silence that followed felt thick enough to drown in. Holloway's smile had faded. "Pretty speech. Doesn't prove anything." "Proves I pay attention," Caleb said quietly. "Proves I know my wife." "We'll see what the court says about that." Holloway gathered his reins. Last chance, Evelyn. Take the offer. 15,000, and you walk away with your dignity intact. Get off my land. For a moment, Holloway just stared at her. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his lawyers scrambling to follow. They disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust, leaving Evelyn and Caleb standing in the middle of the pasture with their hands still clasped. Evelyn realized she was shaking. You didn't have to do that. Do what? Say all those things. About me. Caleb looked at her then, his expression unreadable. They're true. That's not the point. Then what is the point? The point is, Evelyn's voice cracked. The point is, you're not supposed to actually know those things. This was supposed to be simple, legal, uncomplicated. Life's never that simple. Caleb released her hand and took a step back. And for what it's worth, I do sleep on the left side of the bed, in case you were wondering. He walked back toward the barn before she could respond, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the pasture, trying to figure out when everything had gotten so complicated. That night, neither of them mentioned the confrontation. They ate dinner in strained silence, the air between them thick with things neither wanted to say. When Caleb retreated upstairs earlier than usual, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. She was falling for him. That was the terrible truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. Somewhere between the awkward courthouse ceremony and now, Caleb Ryder had stopped being a legal convenience and started being someone she cared about, someone she might even know. She couldn't finish that thought, couldn't let herself go there. But the damage was already done, and they both knew it. The next morning, Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee and something else. Bacon, maybe? She came downstairs to find Caleb at the stove, cooking breakfast. He never cooked breakfast. They usually just grabbed whatever was quick and got straight to work. What's this? She asked. Food. He didn't turn around. Thought we could both use a decent meal. Evelyn sat at the table and watched him work. His movements were efficient but unpracticed, clearly someone who'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than enjoyment. When he set a plate in front of her, the eggs were slightly overdone, and the bacon was more crispy than it needed to be. It was the best breakfast she'd had in months. They ate in silence for a while before Caleb finally spoke. We need to talk about what happens if we lose. We're not going to lose. Evelyn. I said we're not going to lose. She set down her fork harder than necessary. I can't think about that possibility. We have to. If the annulment goes through, the deed transfer gets voided. The county will force the sale. We need to figure out what comes next. There is no next. This ranch is all I have. That's not true. Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. You have skills. You could work for another rancher, or, I don't want to work for someone else. I want to work my own land. Evelyn felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. This place is everything my parents built. It's everything I am. If I lose it, I lose myself. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then we make sure you don't lose it. How? Holloway has lawyers, witnesses, money. What do we have? Each other. He said it simply, like it was obvious. And the truth. The truth is that I married you to save this ranch. The truth, Caleb corrected, is that you married me to save this ranch and then something changed, for both of us. That's not fraud, Evelyn. That's just life. She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. Something had changed. She'd felt it that night in the kitchen when he touched her face. She'd felt it every morning when she came downstairs to find coffee waiting. She'd felt it yesterday when he'd listed all those tiny details about her life like they mattered. Like she mattered. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Of losing the ranch? Of all of it. The ranch? This... She gestured between them. Whatever this is. I'm scared of wanting things again because wanting leads to losing. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. I can't promise you won't lose the ranch. I wish I could, but I can't. But I can promise you won't lose me. Whatever happens in that courthouse, whatever the judge decides, I'm not going anywhere. You can't know that. I do know it. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. I told you about my first marriage, about losing Sarah and Emma. What I didn't tell you is that I swore I'd never care about anyone again, never put myself in a position to hurt like that. And? And then you walked into that feed store looking fierce and terrified at the same time. And I said yes before you even finished asking because some part of me knew I was already gone. Caleb's voice was rough. I tried to keep it simple, tried to maintain distance, but you made that impossible. Evelyn's heart was hammering. Caleb, let me finish. He took a breath. I don't know what happens after the hearing, but I know that somewhere between fixing your barn door and delivering that calf and watching you work yourself to exhaustion because you're too stubborn to quit, I fell in love with you. And that's not going to change regardless of what some judge decides. The world tilted sideways. Evelyn stared at him, at this quiet man who'd agreed to a loveless arrangement and then went and ruined everything by making it real. You don't mean that, she whispered. I do. You can't. We barely know each other. I know you better than I've known anyone in years. Caleb stood, still holding her hand. And I know you feel something too. Maybe not love, not yet, but something. Evelyn wanted to deny it, wanted to pull away and rebuild the walls she'd let crumble, but she was so tired of pretending, and his hand was warm in hers, and the truth was easier than lying. I'm terrified of you, she said. I know. Not of you exactly, of what you represent, of caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy me. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb repeated. How many times do I have to say it before you believe me? I don't know if I can believe it. Everyone leaves eventually. Not everyone. He tugged her gently to her feet, closing the distance between them. Sometimes people stay. Sometimes they choose to stay, even when it's hard. They stood there in the kitchen with the morning light streaming through the windows and the breakfast getting cold on the table. Caleb raised his free hand and cupped her face the way he had that night in the dark, but this time there was nothing tentative about it. Tell me to stop, he said quietly. Evelyn's breath caught. She should tell him to stop, should step back and restore the careful distance they'd maintained, should protect herself from the inevitable pain of caring too much. Instead, she said, Don't. Caleb kissed her then, soft and careful, and nothing like the distant peck he'd given her at the courthouse. This was real. This was want and hope and terror, all tangled together. Evelyn's hands came up to grip his shirt, holding on like he might disappear if she let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We're going to be okay, he murmured. Whatever happens, we're going to be okay. Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt. What if we're not, she whispered. Then we won't be okay together. That's better than being not okay alone. It was possibly the most pragmatic declaration of love Evelyn had ever heard, and somehow that made it more believable than any poetry could have been. She kissed him again, harder this time, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate want into it. Caleb responded in kind, his arms wrapping around her like he could shield her from everything trying to tear them apart. They stood in the kitchen holding each other while the coffee got cold and the day started without them. Two people who'd agreed to a fake marriage and discovered too late that you can't fake this kind of connection. The week before the hearing passed in a blur. Evelyn and Caleb worked the ranch during the day and sat up late at night trying to prepare for every possible question the lawyers might ask. They practiced their story, how they met, when they realized they cared for each other, what their life together looked like. The truth, but carefully edited. They couldn't admit the marriage started as a legal arrangement. That would be handing Holloway exactly what he needed. When did you know you wanted to marry me? Evelyn asked one evening, running through questions for what felt like the 100th time. Caleb looked up from the contract he'd been reading. The honest answer or the one we're giving in court? Both. Honest answer? I knew in the feed store when you looked at me like I was your last hope and you hated yourself for needing help. He set down the papers. Court answer? I'd been watching you from a distance for months, admiring your strength and independence, and when I finally worked up the courage to speak to you, I knew immediately you were someone special. It was a good story, romantic without being unbelievable, the kind of thing a judge might accept. It was also complete fiction. I hate lying, Evelyn said. We're not lying, we're just choosing which truths to tell. That's the same thing. No, it's not. Caleb stood and crossed to where she sat. The truth is that we got married for legal reasons, but it's also true that I care about you, that we've built a real partnership, that this marriage means something to both of us now. We're just emphasizing the second truth over the first. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. What's complicated is everything else. He pulled her to her feet. Come on. You've been staring at those papers for 3 hours. You need a break. We don't have time for breaks. We have time for this. Caleb led her outside where the spring evening was settling into that perfect twilight hour when everything turned gold and soft. Look at it. Evelyn looked. The ranch spread out before them, fields turning green with new growth, mountains rising dark and solid in the distance. Her father had stood in this exact spot countless times, watching the land he'd built from nothing. This is worth fighting for, Caleb said quietly. Not just the land itself, but what it represents. Your family's legacy, your independence, your right to decide what happens to the life you've built. Our life, Evelyn corrected before she could stop herself. Caleb smiled. Our life. They stood in silence, watching the sun sink toward the ridge. Evelyn leaned against him without thinking about it, and his arm came around her shoulders like it belonged there. What if we lose? She asked. We won't. But what if we do? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then we figure out what comes next, together. Maybe we find another piece of land. Maybe we work for someone else until we can buy our own place again. Maybe we do something completely different. I can't imagine doing anything else. You couldn't imagine being married 6 months ago either. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. People adapt. Will adapt. Evelyn wanted to argue, but exhaustion was finally catching up with her. She let herself relax against Caleb's solid warmth and tried to believe that everything would work out. 2 days before the hearing, Frank Morrison showed up at the ranch unannounced. Evelyn saw him riding up and felt her stomach clench. Frank wasn't the type to make social calls. Mr. Morrison, she said when he dismounted, what can I do for you? Frank looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around like he was worried someone might see him there. I came to tell you something, about the hearing. What about it? Holloway's lawyers came to see me and Clara, asked us questions about your wedding, about whether we thought it was legitimate. Frank twisted his hat in his hands. They wanted us to testify that it seemed rushed, that you and Caleb didn't act like a real couple. Ice flooded Evelyn's veins. And what did you tell them? Nothing yet. They're expecting an answer tomorrow. Frank met her eyes. But I wanted you to know that I'm not going to do it. Neither is Clara. You're not? No. Frank's expression was earnest. Look, I'll be honest. When you first proposed to Caleb in my store, I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. And I said some things in town that I'm not proud of. But over the past few months, I've watched you two. The way he looks at you. The way you've started looking at him. And I'll be damned if I help Wade Holloway destroy something real. Evelyn felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Holloway's got other witnesses lined up. Martha Hopkins, for one. She's been telling anyone who'll listen that your marriage is a sham. Frank shook his head. But Claire and I, we're going to testify on your behalf if you want us. Tell the judge what we've seen, that you're building a real life together. That would mean going against Holloway. He won't forget that. Let him remember it. Frank's jaw set stubbornly. Sometimes you've got to stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. After Frank left, Evelyn found Caleb in the barn and told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. That's good, he said when she finished. Having witnesses on our side will help. It won't be enough, not if Martha and others are willing to lie for Holloway. Then we make sure our truth is more convincing than their lies. Caleb set down the harness he'd been repairing. Evelyn, we've done everything we can to prepare. At some point, we just have to trust that it's enough. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I. He smiled slightly. But we're learning together. The night before the hearing, neither of them could sleep. Evelyn lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Caleb move around in the next room. Around midnight, she gave up and went downstairs. Caleb was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He looked up when she entered, unsurprised. Couldn't sleep? He asked. No. Evelyn poured her own coffee and sat across from him. Keep thinking about everything that could go wrong. That's not helpful. I know. Can't stop anyway. She wrapped her hands around the mug. Caleb, if we lose, we won't. If we lose, she continued firmly, I want you to know that I don't regret any of this. Marrying you, even if it cost me the ranch. It was still the right choice. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. We're not losing. You can't know that. I know that we're going into that courthouse together. I know that we're telling the truth about our marriage being real. And I know that has to count for something. He squeezed her fingers. Have a little faith, Evelyn. Faith in what? In us. They sat in the quiet kitchen holding hands while the clock ticked toward tomorrow, and Evelyn tried to find some scrap of the faith Caleb seemed to have in abundance. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear. Evelyn dressed in her best clothes, the same blue dress she'd worn to the courthouse wedding, though it felt like a lifetime ago now, instead of just 3 months. Caleb wore his Sunday shirt and the pants he usually saved for town. They looked like respectable married people. Evelyn just hoped it would be enough. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Half of Black Hollow had shown up to watch the spectacle, crowding into the gallery like this was entertainment instead of Evelyn's entire life on the line. She saw Martha Hopkins sitting in the front row looking smug, saw Wade Holloway and his expensive lawyers at their table, papers spread out with military precision. Frank and Clara Morrison sat near the back, and when Evelyn caught Frank's eye, he nodded encouragingly. All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Thornton. Everyone stood as the judge entered, an older man with steel gray hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away. He took his seat behind the bench and surveyed the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure. This is a hearing regarding the petition for annulment filed by Wade Holloway against Evelyn and Caleb Ryder, he said. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed. Howard Blackwell stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. Your Honor, we're here today because Mrs. Ryder has committed fraud. She entered into a sham marriage for the sole purpose of circumventing the county land sale statute. We have witnesses who will testify to the rushed nature of this marriage, the lack of genuine affection between the parties, and the purely transactional nature of their arrangement. He went on for another 10 minutes, painting Evelyn as a desperate woman who'd manipulated an innocent man to save her property. Every word was carefully chosen to make her sound calculating and dishonest. When he finally sat down, Judge Thornton turned to Evelyn and Caleb. Do you have legal representation? No, Your Honor, Caleb said, standing. We're representing ourselves. I see. Thornton didn't look pleased. Very well. You'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations. Mr. Blackwell, call your first witness. Martha Hopkins practically ran to the witness stand. Under Blackwell's gentle questioning, she painted a damning picture. Yes, Evelyn had proposed to Caleb in the feed store with barely any warning. Yes, they'd gotten married within days. No, she'd never seen them display genuine affection in public. Yes, it certainly seemed like a marriage of convenience designed to skirt the law. Evelyn felt sick listening to it. Every word was technically true, twisted just enough to sound damning. When it was Caleb's turn to question Martha, he stood slowly. Mrs. Hopkins, how many times have you been to our ranch? Martha blinked. I don't see what that has to... Please answer the question. Never. I haven't been to your ranch. So you have no direct knowledge of how we interact in our own home. Is that correct? Well, no, but... And when you see us in town, how long are those interactions usually? A few minutes, I suppose. A few minutes. Caleb let that hang in the air. And based on those few-minute interactions in public places, you feel qualified to judge the intimacy of our marriage? I know what I've seen, Martha said defensively. You know what you've chosen to see, Caleb corrected. Thank you. No further questions. Blackwell called 2 more witnesses, neighbors who testified to the sudden nature of the marriage and their doubts about its authenticity. Each time, Caleb asked simple questions that undermined their certainty. Did they live with us? Did they see our daily interactions? How could they know what happened in the privacy of our home? By the time Holloway's lawyers rested their case, doubt had been planted. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Judge Thornton looked at Caleb. Do you wish to call any witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Frank Morrison. Frank took the stand looking nervous but determined. Under Caleb's questioning, he described what he'd witnessed in his feed store that day, but also what he'd seen in the months since, the way Caleb and Evelyn had grown comfortable with each other, the small touches and glances that suggested genuine affection. In your opinion, Mr. Morrison, is this marriage real? Caleb asked. Frank didn't hesitate. Yes, it is now, whatever it might have been at the start. Clara Morrison testified next, saying essentially the same thing. Then, to Evelyn's surprise, Tom Brady the blacksmith took the stand and described seeing them together, working in partnership, supporting each other. They look like every other married couple I've known, Tom said simply. Maybe they started out rough, but they've grown into it. When the witnesses were finished, Judge Thornton looked at Evelyn and Caleb. I'd like to hear from the two of you directly. Mrs. Ryder, please take the stand. Evelyn's legs felt shaky as she walked to the witness chair. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat and faced the judge. Mrs. Ryder, Thornton said, did you marry Mr. Ryder primarily to avoid the county land sales statute? This was it, the moment everything hinged on. Evelyn took a breath and made her choice. Yes, she said. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Holloway's lawyers looked triumphant. Caleb's face went carefully blank. But that's not the whole truth, Evelyn continued. I did propose to Caleb to save my ranch. I won't lie about that. But I chose him specifically because he was the only man in this town I trusted, the only one who'd never looked at my land with greed, and what started as a legal arrangement became something real. How convenient, Blackwell interjected. Judge Thornton silenced him with a look. Continue, Mrs. Ryder. I didn't expect to care about him, Evelyn said. I told myself it would be simple. Marry, file the papers, live separate lives under the same roof. But Caleb made that impossible. He showed up every day and did the work without being asked. He fixed things I didn't know were broken. He delivered a calf at 2 a.m. and never complained. He stood beside me when I was terrified and told me we'd face it together. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. I don't know exactly when the marriage became real. Maybe it was the night he told me about his first wife and daughter. Maybe it was when he grabbed my wrist to keep me from walking into a storm. Maybe it was the morning I came downstairs and realized I'd been listening for his footsteps. All I know is that somewhere along the way, Caleb Ryder stopped being a legal convenience and started being my husband in every way that matters. The courtroom was silent. And if this court decides that's fraud, Evelyn finished, then I guess I'm guilty. But it's the truth. Judge Thornton's expression remained unreadable as Evelyn stepped down from the witness stand. Her legs felt unsteady, and she had to grip the railing to keep from stumbling. She'd just admitted under oath to exactly what Holloway's lawyers had accused her of. The gasps and whispers from the gallery followed her back to her seat like accusations. Caleb's hand found hers under the table, his grip warm and steady. He didn't say anything, but his thumb traced a small circle on her palm, the same gesture he'd made that day outside the feed store when Wade Holloway had confronted them. Mr. Ryder, Judge Thornton said, please take the stand. Caleb stood and walked to the witness chair with that same unhurried calm he brought to everything. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and sat facing the courtroom like he was discussing cattle prices instead of the validity of his marriage. Blackwell was on his feet immediately. Mr. Ryder, you heard Mrs. Ryder's testimony. She admitted that this marriage began as a legal arrangement to circumvent the county statute. Do you dispute that? No, Caleb said simply. More gasps. Holloway leaned forward in his seat, looking like Christmas had come early. So you admit this marriage was fraudulent from the start, Blackwell pressed. I admit we got married for practical reasons, Caleb corrected. That's not the same as fraud. Isn't it? You entered into a legal contract with no intention of honoring the spirit of that contract. We honored it every day. Caleb's voice stayed level. We lived together as husband and wife. We worked the land together. We built a partnership. How is that not honoring the marriage? Because you didn't love each other when you married. Plenty of people don't love each other when they marry, Caleb pointed out. Arranged marriages have been common for centuries. Does that make them all fraudulent? Blackwell's jaw tightened. Those marriages are entered into with family approval and social expectations. Your marriage was a deliberate attempt to manipulate. My marriage, Caleb interrupted, was an agreement between two adults who needed each other. Evelyn needed a husband to keep her land. I needed... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I needed a reason to stop running from my past. Judge Thornton leaned forward slightly. Explain that, Mr. Ryder? Caleb took a breath. I told Evelyn this already, but for the court's record, I was married before. My wife Sarah and our daughter Emma died from fever 8 years ago. After that, I spent years moving from place to place, never settling, never letting myself care about anything or anyone. When I came to Black Hollow, I told myself it would be temporary, just another stop. His eyes found Evelyn's across the courtroom. Then Evelyn came into that feed store and asked me to marry her, and I said yes because I thought it would be safe. A marriage without emotion, without risk, without the possibility of loss. But I was wrong. Wrong how? Thornton asked. Wrong because you can't share someone's life without it changing you. Wrong because spending every day with someone, watching them work themselves to exhaustion, seeing them refuse to quit even when everything's stacked against them, that builds something whether you plan for it or not. Caleb's voice roughened. I fell in love with my wife, Your Honor. Not because I had to, but because she made it impossible not to. The courtroom had gone silent. Even Blackwell seemed momentarily at a loss for words. When exactly did you fall in love with Mrs. Ryder? Judge Thornton asked. Caleb considered the question. I don't know if there was one moment. Maybe it was when she delivered that calf at 2 a.m, with her hands shaking from exhaustion, but she wouldn't stop until she knew it was safe. Maybe it was the night I found her sitting in the dark kitchen trying not to cry because she was so scared of losing everything. Or maybe it was just the accumulation of 100 small moments, the way she talks to the cattle, the way she reads the same books over and over, the way she's so damn stubborn she'd rather die than admit she needs help. He looked directly at Judge Thornton. I can't tell you the exact moment, but I can tell you that when Wade Holloway showed up at our ranch and threatened her, my first thought wasn't about the land or the legal arrangement. It was that I'd do whatever it took to protect my wife. And that's when I knew this marriage had become real. Blackwell recovered his composure. Very touching, Mr. Ryder, but the law requires that a marriage be entered into in good faith. You've both admitted that wasn't the case here. We entered into it with honest intentions, Caleb countered. We never lied about getting married. We filed the legal paperwork. We've lived as husband and wife. Just because our reasons weren't romantic doesn't make the marriage invalid. Your Honor, Blackwell said, turning to the judge, the respondents have admitted to exactly what we alleged, a marriage of convenience designed to circumvent the law. Their feelings now are irrelevant. What matters is their intent at the time of the ceremony. Judge Thornton was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to ask you a question. How many married couples do you think enter into marriage for purely romantic reasons, with no practical considerations whatsoever? Blackwell blinked. I'm not sure I understand the relevance. Answer the question. Well, I suppose most marriages involve some practical considerations. Financial security, family connections, social status, property consolidation, Thornton listed. Would you argue that all those marriages are fraudulent? Of course not, but the difference here is that Mr. and Mrs. Ryder were honest about their practical reasons. They didn't pretend to be madly in love when they weren't. They entered into a legal arrangement that served both their needs. And then, according to multiple witnesses, including themselves, they built a genuine relationship. The judge looked at Caleb. Mr. Ryder, do you currently reside at the Mercer Ranch? Yes, Your Honor. Do you share household expenses with your wife? Yes. Do you work the land together? Every day. Do you present yourselves publicly as a married couple? We do. Thornton turned to Evelyn. Mrs. Ryder, same questions. Do you and Mr. Ryder live together as husband and wife? Yes, Your Honor, Evelyn said, standing. Do you share your life with him in a way that would be recognizable as a marriage to any reasonable observer? Yes. The judge sat back. Mr. Blackwell, I've heard your witnesses testify about their suspicions and judgments, but suspicion isn't proof. The fact remains that these two people got married legally, have lived as a married couple for 3 months, and by all accounts have developed a genuine partnership. You're asking me to annul their marriage based on their initial motivations rather than their current reality. The statute is clear, Your Honor. The marriage must be entered into in good faith. And what is good faith? Thornton interrupted. Is it the presence of romantic love at the moment of the ceremony? Because if that's the standard, I suspect half the marriages in this territory would be invalid. Or is it the honest intention to honor the obligations of marriage, to live together, support each other, build a life together? Because by that standard, the Ryders have met every requirement. Holloway's lawyers exchanged glances. Evelyn felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest, but she was afraid to trust it. "I'm going to take a short recess to review the relevant statutes," Thornton announced. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. The gallery erupted in conversation the moment the judge left. Evelyn turned to Caleb, her heart hammering. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "I think it means he's actually considering our side," Caleb said quietly. "But don't get your hopes up yet." Too late. They stood and made their way through the crowd toward the courthouse doors. People pressed in from all sides, some offering encouragement, others looking disappointed that the scandal hadn't ended in their favor. Evelyn kept her head down and let Caleb guide her through. Outside, the spring air felt shockingly fresh after the stuffiness of the packed courtroom. Evelyn leaned against the building and took several deep breaths. "You did good in there," Caleb said. "I basically admitted to everything Holloway accused us of." "You told the truth. That took guts. Or stupidity." Evelyn rubbed her face. "I couldn't lie, Caleb. Not under oath. Not about something this important." "I know. That's why I love you." The words were said so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. But they hit Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. He'd said it before, but hearing it again, here, now, in the middle of everything, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Don't say that," she said. "Why not? It's true." "Because if we lose, it'll hurt more." Caleb moved closer, blocking her view of the street and the curious onlookers. "Evelyn, we're going to hurt regardless of what happens in there. Might as well hurt over something real." Before she could respond, Frank Morrison appeared beside them. "That went better than I expected," he said. "Judge Thornton seems fair." "Fair doesn't always mean favorable," Evelyn replied. "No, but it's better than the alternative." Frank glanced back at the courthouse. "Holloway looks worried. That's got to be a good sign." Clara Morrison joined them, slightly out of breath. "That Blackwell lawyer tried to corner me in the hallway. Wanted to know if I'd reconsider my testimony. I told him exactly where he could stick his reconsideration." Despite everything, Evelyn smiled. "Thank you both for standing with us." "Of course," Clara said, squeezing her arm. "That's what neighbors do." The 30 minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Evelyn and Caleb stood together on the courthouse steps, not talking much, just existing in each other's presence while the town swirled around them. When the bailiff finally called them back inside, Evelyn's hands were shaking. "Whatever happens," Caleb murmured as they walked back in, "we face it together." Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice. The courtroom settled as Judge Thornton returned to the bench. His expression gave nothing away, and Evelyn felt her stomach drop. She'd seen that look before, the carefully neutral face of someone about to deliver bad news. "I've reviewed the relevant statutes and case law," Thornton began. "The county land sale statute in question was enacted in 1867 with the stated purpose of preventing land fraud and ensuring proper management of valuable property. The marriage statute requires that marriages be entered into in good faith, meaning with genuine intention to honor the obligations of matrimony." He paused, and Evelyn's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. The petitioner argues that Mrs. Ryder's marriage to Mr. Ryder was fraudulent because it was motivated primarily by a desire to circumvent the land sale requirement. The respondents don't dispute this. What they argue instead is that their motivations at the start are less relevant than their actions since. Thornton looked at Holloway, then at Evelyn and Caleb. "I find myself agreeing with the respondents." The words took a moment to register. When they did, Evelyn grabbed Caleb's hand so hard she probably hurt him. "The law requires good faith," Thornton continued, "but good faith is demonstrated through actions, not emotions. Mr. and Mrs. Ryder have lived together as a married couple for 3 months. They've combined their households, shared their resources, and by multiple accounts, including their own, developed a genuine partnership. The fact that their initial motivations were practical rather than romantic doesn't invalidate the legitimacy of their marriage." Blackwell shot to his feet. "Your Honor, with respect, you're creating a precedent that would allow anyone to manipulate—" "I'm creating no such precedent," Thornton said sharply. "I'm simply recognizing that marriage is a complex institution that serves multiple purposes: romantic, practical, social, and economic. To invalidate every marriage that began with practical considerations would be absurd. What matters is whether the parties are honoring their obligations to each other, and the evidence clearly shows that the Ryders are doing exactly that." He turned to the respondents' table. That being said, I do want to address the specific concern about land fraud. Mrs. Ryder, if you were to divorce Mr. Ryder tomorrow and reclaim sole ownership of your property, it would certainly suggest that this marriage was never genuine. Do you understand that? Evelyn stood on shaking legs. Yes, Your Honor. And do you intend to remain married to Mr. Ryder? She looked at Caleb, who was watching her with an expression that made her chest tight. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Mr. Ryder? Caleb stood beside her. I intend to remain married to my wife for as long as she'll have me. Thornton nodded slowly. Then my ruling is as follows. The petition for annulment is denied. The marriage between Evelyn Mercer Ryder and Caleb James Ryder is legally valid. The deed transfer stands as filed. Mr. Holloway, your challenge is dismissed. The courtroom exploded. Evelyn heard shouting, applause, angry protests all blending together into meaningless noise. She stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. They'd won. After months of fear and fighting and sleepless nights, they'd actually won. Evelyn, Caleb said quietly, and she turned to find him watching her with something that looked like joy. We won. We won, she repeated, and then the reality of it hit her and her knees buckled. Caleb caught her before she fell, his arms coming around her in a grip that felt safe and solid and real. Evelyn buried her face against his shoulder and felt the tears she'd been holding back for months finally break free. We won, she said again, muffled against his shirt. Yeah, we did. He was laughing, she realized, actually laughing. We actually did it. People surrounded them, Frank and Clara, Tom Brady, even some faces Evelyn didn't immediately recognize. Everyone talking at once, offering congratulations, reliving the best moments of the hearing. Through it all, Caleb held her like she might disappear if he let go. Across the courtroom, Wade Holloway stood with his lawyers, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Evelyn met his eyes over Caleb's shoulder and saw the promise there. This wasn't over, not for him. But for now, right now, it was enough. Judge Thornton banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. This court is adjourned. Everyone please clear the courtroom. The crowd slowly dispersed, though people kept stopping to shake Caleb's hand or embrace Evelyn. It took almost 20 minutes before they finally made it outside into the spring sunshine. The ride back to the ranch felt surreal. Evelyn kept expecting someone to chase them down, to tell them there'd been a mistake, that the ruling was reversed. But no one came. They rode in silence through the greening landscape, and with each mile, the reality of what they'd accomplished settled deeper into Evelyn's bones. The ranch looked the same when they arrived. Same weathered house, same leaning barn, same cattle in the pasture. But somehow it felt different. Lighter, maybe. Or maybe that was just Evelyn herself feeling lighter. She dismounted and stood looking at the land that had nearly cost her everything, the land she'd fought so hard to keep. Her father's legacy, her mother's memory, her entire identity wrapped up in 200 acres of mountain valley. It's really ours, she said quietly. Caleb came to stand beside her. It was always yours. Ours, she corrected. The deed has both our names on it. Legal technicality. No. Evelyn turned to face him. It's ours. I meant what I said in that courtroom, about this marriage being real, about you being my husband, all of it. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Yeah? Yeah. She took a breath. I love you. I don't know when it happened exactly, and I'm probably terrible at showing it, but it's true. I love you, Caleb Ryder. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he laughed, a full, genuine sound that Evelyn had rarely heard from him, and pulled her into a kiss that made her forget about land deeds and courtrooms and everything except the feel of him solid and real and hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said. In case that wasn't clear. It was pretty clear. Evelyn smiled. You did give a very moving speech in court. Had to make sure the judge understood. I think everyone understood. She paused. What happens now? Now we live our lives. Caleb pulled back to look at her properly. We work the ranch, we build something together, we figure out what comes next as we go. That's simple? That's simple. It probably wouldn't be simple at all, Evelyn thought. There would be more challenges, more people like Holloway trying to tear them down, more moments of doubt and fear and struggle. But standing there with Caleb's arms around her and the ranch spread out before them, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. They spent the rest of the day doing normal ranch work, feeding cattle, checking fences, all the mundane tasks that had filled their days for months. But everything felt different now. When Caleb reached past her to grab a tool, she didn't tense. When they passed each other in the barn, she let herself smile. When they came inside for dinner, sweaty and tired and covered in dust, it felt like coming home in a way it hadn't before. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. The spring air was cool, but not cold, carrying the scent of new grass and mountain pine. Evelyn leaned against Caleb's shoulder, and his arm came around her automatically. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd asked someone else?" she asked. "If you'd said no?" "All the time," Caleb admitted. "And I'm grateful every day that you asked me and I was smart enough to say yes. Even with all the drama and the court case and Holloway? Even with all that," he pressed a kiss to her temple. "You were worth fighting for, Evelyn. The ranch was just a bonus." She turned to look at him in the fading light. "You know we're actually stuck with each other now, right? We stood up in court and said we're staying married. Can't back out without looking like frauds." "Is that your way of proposing again?" "Maybe." Evelyn felt herself smile. "Except this time it's real. No legal loopholes, no desperate circumstances, just us." "Just us," Caleb echoed. "I can live with that." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and was answered by another. The cattle settled for the night with soft lowing sounds. The old house creaked as it cooled from the day's warmth. All the sounds of home. "I want to do it properly," Evelyn said suddenly. "Do what?" "Marry you. Not in a courthouse with hostile witnesses. Not because we have to." She sat up to face him. "I want to stand in front of people who actually care about us and say the words like I mean them." Caleb studied her face. "You want a real wedding?" "Is that crazy?" "No." He smiled. "But we're already married. So we'll get married again. People do it all the time, renew their vows or whatever." Evelyn felt herself getting excited about the idea. "Nothing fancy, just our friends, maybe at the ranch, a real celebration instead of a legal maneuver." "When?" "I don't know, summer maybe, after we get the planting done and before harvest." She paused. "Unless you think it's stupid, I think," Caleb said slowly, "that marrying you once was the best decision I ever made. Doing it again sounds even better." They started planning it right there on the porch as the night settled around them. Nothing elaborate. Clara could make a cake, they'd ask Frank to stand up as best man, maybe have it near the creek where the wildflowers would be blooming. Simple and genuine, the way everything between them had become. By the time they finally went inside, the moon was high, and the house was dark except for the lamp they'd left burning in the kitchen. Evelyn banked the fire while Caleb locked the doors. Small domestic routines they'd fallen into without discussing. At the base of the stairs, they paused. For 3 months, they'd said goodnight here and retreated to separate rooms. The space between them now felt charged with possibility. "I should," Evelyn started. "Do you want to?" Caleb asked quietly. "Want to what?" "Sleep alone. Is that still what you want?" Evelyn thought about the empty bed upstairs. About 3 months of sleeping alone while the man she loved was just down the hall. Thought about all the walls they'd carefully maintained and whether any of them still made sense. "No," she said. "That's not what I want anymore." Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness. "What do you want?" "You. Just you." He led her upstairs, past the spare room where he'd been sleeping, to her room at the end of the hall. The bed she'd been sleeping on the right side of for no good reason except habit. The room that had been hers alone for so long. They undressed without fanfare, just two people who'd worked together all day shedding their dirty clothes. When Caleb slid into bed beside her, Evelyn realized this was the first time they'd shared a bed, despite being married for 3 months. "This is weird," she said. "Yeah." "Good weird or bad weird?" Caleb pulled her against him, and Evelyn felt herself relax into the warmth of him. "Good weird," he decided. "Definitely good weird." She fell asleep curled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling safer than she had in years. And when she woke in the middle of the night from a half-remembered nightmare about losing the ranch, Caleb was there to pull her close and murmur reassurances until she drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Evelyn woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. For a moment, she lay there confused about why her room smelled like coffee and why the bed felt heavier than usual. Then she remembered and smiled. Caleb was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching her. "Morning." "Morning," Evelyn stretched. "Did you make coffee?" "Hours ago. It's probably terrible by now." "Why didn't you wake me?" "Because you looked peaceful, and you've barely slept in months." He brushed hair from her face. "Figured you'd earned a morning in." Evelyn caught his hand and held it against her cheek. "I could get used to this." "Good, because I'm planning on it being a permanent arrangement." They eventually dragged themselves out of bed and downstairs, where Caleb made fresh coffee while Evelyn started breakfast. Moving around the kitchen together felt different now, less careful, more natural. When Caleb reached past her for the sugar, she didn't move away. When she turned and found him close behind her, she leaned back against him instead of stepping aside. Small changes that added up to everything. They were finishing breakfast when someone knocked on the door. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Caleb. They weren't expecting visitors. She opened the door to find Frank Morrison standing on the porch, hat in hand and looking uncomfortable. "Frank, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly," Frank said. "I just thought you should know, Wade Holloway left town this morning." Evelyn's stomach clenched. "Left? What do you mean left?" "Took his lawyers and his palomino and rode out before dawn. Tom Brady saw them heading toward the county seat." Frank twisted his hat. "Word is he's done with Black Hollow. Lost too much face over this whole business." "He's really gone?" Evelyn couldn't quite believe it. "Looks that way. Sold his ranch to some outfit from back east, packed up his things, and left." Frank smiled slightly. "You beat him, Evelyn. You and Caleb actually beat him." After Frank left, Evelyn stood in the doorway staring at nothing. Holloway was gone. The man who'd threatened and intimidated her for months, who tried to steal her land, who dragged her through court, just gone. "You all right?" Caleb asked from behind her. "I don't know." Evelyn turned to face him. "I thought I'd feel more triumphant, but mostly I just feel tired." "That's because you've been fighting for so long, you forgot how to do anything else." Caleb pulled her close. "Now you get to figure out what comes after the fight." "What does come after?" "Life," he said simply. "Just life. The boring, beautiful, everyday kind that doesn't involve lawyers or courtrooms or people trying to steal what's yours." Evelyn leaned against him and let herself imagine it. Days of working the ranch, nights spent together, a future that wasn't defined by survival but by building something worth keeping. "I think I'd like that," she said. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She pulled back to look at him. "So let's start now. No more fighting, no more fear. Just us and this ranch and whatever comes next." Caleb smiled. That rare, full smile that made him look years younger. "Sounds perfect." And standing there in the doorway of the house that had nearly cost her everything, wrapped in the arms of a man she'd married for all the wrong reasons and loved for all the right ones, Evelyn Ryder finally let herself believe that everything might actually be okay. The weeks that followed Holloway's departure had a dreamlike quality that Evelyn didn't quite trust. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some new crisis to emerge from the mountains and threaten everything they'd fought for. But the crisis never came. Instead, spring rolled into early summer with nothing more dramatic than a broken irrigation line and a cow that got herself stuck in a boggy section of the lower pasture. Normal problems. The kind you solved with tools and sweat instead of lawyers and courtroom testimony. Caleb noticed her waiting for disaster. He didn't comment on it directly, but Evelyn caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that was equal parts amusement and concern. "You know it's okay to relax," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after a long day of fence repair. "The war's over. You won." "We won," Evelyn corrected automatically. "We won," he agreed. "So why do you still look like you're expecting an ambush?" Evelyn considered the question. The honest answer was complicated and a little embarrassing. "I don't know how to do this," she finally admitted. "Do what?" "Be happy. Just be happy without waiting for it to get taken away." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness. My ma used to say that some people spend so long surviving that they forget how to live. I think maybe that's what you're doing. Your mother sounds wise. She had her moments. He squeezed her fingers. But she also said that living is a choice you make every day. You can choose to keep surviving, keep waiting for the next bad thing. Or you can choose to actually live in the good moments when they come. And if the good moments don't last? They won't, Caleb said bluntly. Nothing lasts forever. But that doesn't make them less valuable while you have them. Evelyn turned to look at him in the fading light. When did you get so philosophical? I've had a lot of time to think about it. 8 years of running from happiness will do that. He pulled her closer. I don't want to run anymore, Evelyn, and I don't want you to spend our life together braced for impact. I'll try, she said, but I'm not promising miracles. I'm not asking for miracles. Just try. She did try. It wasn't easy. A lifetime of preparing for the worst didn't just evaporate because a judge ruled in their favor, but slowly, incrementally, Evelyn started letting herself relax into the rhythm of their life together. They set a date for their second wedding, the last Saturday in June, when the wildflowers would be at their peak and the weather would be warm enough for an outdoor ceremony. Clara Morrison took over planning with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for royal weddings, despite Evelyn's protests that they wanted something simple. It will be simple, Clara assured her. Simple, but beautiful. You deserve beautiful, Evelyn. Evelyn wasn't sure she deserved anything, but she let Clara have her way because arguing seemed like more trouble than it was worth. The planning gave the town something to talk about besides the scandal of the courthouse wedding and Holloway's sudden departure. People stopped whispering when Evelyn walked by and started offering congratulations instead. Martha Hopkins even apologized, sort of. I may have been hasty in my judgment, Martha said stiffly when she cornered Evelyn outside the general store. You and Mr. Ryder seem to have developed a genuine partnership. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Martha Hopkins it was practically a declaration of eternal friendship. Thank you, Martha, Evelyn said, because she was trying to be gracious these days. Though I still say proposing in a feed store was unseemly, Martha added, unable to help herself. Some things never changed. As June approached, Caleb asked Evelyn a question that caught her completely off guard. They were working in the vegetable garden behind the house, Evelyn's project that Caleb had helped expand, when he said, Have you thought about what comes after? After what? After the wedding. After we're settled. After everything becomes routine. He pulled a weed and tossed it aside. Have you thought about whether you want kids? Evelyn's hand stilled in the dirt. I haven't let myself think that far ahead. Maybe you should start. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Do you want children? I did once. Sarah and I talked about having more after Emma. His expression went distant. Then they died, and I told myself I'd never go through that again. Never love something that vulnerable, that fragile. And now? Now I'm married to someone who makes me want things I thought I'd given up on. Caleb met her eyes. I'm not saying we need to decide today, but if you want kids, I'd like to know. And if you don't, I'd like to know that too. Evelyn thought about it, really thought about it for the first time in years. She'd always assumed she'd be alone, that children weren't in her future because marriage wasn't in her future. But now everything had changed. I think I'd like to try, she said carefully. Not right away, but someday. If it happens. If it happens, Caleb agreed. No pressure, no expectations, just if it happens. They went back to weeding, but the conversation settled into Evelyn's mind and took root alongside the vegetables. A future that included not just her and Caleb, but maybe something more. Something they'd build together from scratch. The thought was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. 2 weeks before the wedding, a letter arrived from the county assessor's office. Evelyn's hands shook as she opened it, convinced it was some new legal challenge, some loophole Holloway had found before he left. Instead, it was a formal apology. The county acknowledged that the land sale statute had been applied inconsistently and often unfairly. Several assessors had been removed from their positions for accepting bribes from wealthy landowners. The statute itself was being revised to remove the marriage requirement. They're changing the law, Evelyn said, reading the letter again to make sure she understood correctly. Women can inherit land outright now, no husband required. Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. How do you feel about that? Angry that it took this long? Relieved it's finally happening? She set the letter down. And grateful that I didn't wait for them to fix it before taking action. You saved other women from going through what you went through. Maybe, Evelyn smiled slightly, though I'm not sure I'd recommend my particular method to anyone else. Worked out all right in the end? Yeah, it did. That night, lying in bed with Caleb's arm around her and the window open to let in the cool mountain air, Evelyn found herself thinking about all the women who'd come before her. Her mother, who'd worked this land alongside her father until fever took her. Her grandmother, who'd come west in a wagon and helped build the original homestead. All the women who'd fought and survived and persisted even when the laws and society told them they couldn't. She'd added her name to that legacy now, not just by keeping the ranch, but by refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her life. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked sleepily. Everything. Nothing. How strange it is that proposing to you in a feed store led to this. Regrets? Not even one. She turned to face him in the darkness. You? Only that I didn't meet you sooner? We probably would have hated each other if we'd met earlier. I was even more difficult before my father died. Caleb laughed quietly. Hard to imagine. It's true. I had something to prove to everyone. Now I only have something to prove to myself. And what's that? That I can build something that lasts, that I can trust someone enough to let them in. She paused. That I can be happy without constantly waiting for it to end. How's that going so far? Evelyn considered the question honestly. Better than I expected. Harder than it should be, but better. I'll take better. They fell asleep tangled together, and for once Evelyn didn't dream about losing anything. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect June day that made photographers weep with joy. Evelyn woke early and lay in bed watching the sunlight paint patterns on the ceiling, listening to Caleb's steady breathing beside her. In a few hours she'd marry him again. This time there would be no legal pressure, no desperate circumstances, no ulterior motives. Just two people who'd chosen each other and wanted to make that choice public. You're awake, Caleb murmured without opening his eyes. How did you know? Your breathing changed. He rolled toward her. Nervous? A little, which is stupid since we're already married. Not stupid. This one counts more somehow. Yeah. Evelyn traced a finger along his jaw. This one's real. The first one was real too. We just didn't know it yet. Clara arrived at 9 with a dress she'd altered from her own wedding gown 30 years earlier. It was simple ivory cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Nothing fancy, but infinitely better than the blue church dress Evelyn had worn to the courthouse. You're not getting married in work clothes this time, Clara declared, shooing Caleb out of the house. Out. You can see her at the ceremony like a proper groom. Caleb went without complaint, shooting Evelyn an amused glance over his shoulder as he left. Clara helped Evelyn into the dress, pinning and tucking until it fit properly. When Evelyn finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked soft somehow, feminine in a way she'd spent most of her life rejecting. You're beautiful, Clara said firmly. Don't even try to argue. I wasn't going to argue, Evelyn said, surprising herself. Though I'm not sure Caleb will recognize me. Oh, he'll recognize you. He'd recognize you in a burlap sack. Clara smiled. That man looks at you like you hung the moon. People started arriving around noon. Not the whole town. Evelyn had made it clear this was for friends only, but enough to fill the meadow near the creek where they'd set up chairs and a simple wooden arch that Caleb and Tom Brady had built together. Frank Morrison stood with Caleb at the front, both men looking uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. Evelyn watched from the house as guests settled into their seats and felt her nerves kick up another notch. Ready? Clara asked. As I'll ever be. They decided against the traditional wedding march. Instead, Evelyn simply walked down the aisle between the chairs with no fanfare, no one giving her away because she'd never belonged to anyone but herself. When she reached the front and saw Caleb's expression, wonder mixed with love, mixed with something that looked like relief, her nerves evaporated. This was right. This was exactly where she was supposed to be. The ceremony was short and simple. Frank's brother-in-law, a circuit preacher who happened to be visiting, spoke about partnership and commitment and building a life together. Then it was time for the vows. I'm not good with words, Evelyn said, her voice carrying across the quiet meadow. Never have been. But I'm going to try anyway. She took a breath and looked at Caleb. 6 months ago, I asked you to marry me because I was desperate, and you were the only man I trusted. You said yes, and I spent weeks convinced I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd trapped us both in something that would end in disaster. Someone in the audience laughed softly. I was wrong, Evelyn continued. What I trapped us in was the best decision I've ever made. You showed up every day. You worked beside me without being asked. You held me together when I was falling apart. You made me believe that maybe I didn't have to face everything alone. Her voice caught and she had to pause for a moment. I love you, Caleb Ryder. Not because the law requires it, not because it's convenient, but because you're the best man I've ever known. And I promise to spend the rest of my life being someone worthy of the trust you put in me when you said yes to a desperate proposal in a feed store. Caleb's eyes were suspiciously bright. When it was his turn, he cleared his throat twice before speaking. Evelyn, when you walked into that feed store and asked me to marry you, I said yes before you finished talking. Frank thought I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. He smiled. But some part of me knew even then that you were something special, that saying yes to you was the smartest thing I'd done in years. He took her hands. You saved me as much as I saved you. Gave me a reason to stop running from my past. Gave me a home when I'd convinced myself I'd never have one again. You're strong and stubborn, and you work too hard, and you're terrible at asking for help. And I love every single one of those things about you. There was more laughter from the audience. I promise to stand beside you for whatever comes next, Caleb said. Good years and bad years, easy times and hard times. I promise to see you, really see you, not just the ranch or the work or the walls you put up. And I promise to remind you every single day that you're not alone anymore, because you're not. You have me, and I have you, and that's enough. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, again. And this time when Caleb kissed her, it was in front of people who actually cared about them, instead of people who'd come to watch them fail. The celebration that followed was exactly the kind of simple, genuine gathering Evelyn had hoped for. Clara had made a cake that was slightly lopsided but tasted perfect. Someone had brought a fiddle, and impromptu dancing broke out in the meadow. People ate and drank and told stories as the afternoon faded into evening. Evelyn found herself pulled into a dance by Tom Brady, who apologized for his clumsy footwork while managing not to step on her feet even once. When the song ended, Caleb cut in smoothly. Having fun? He asked as they swayed together. Actually, yes. I didn't expect to, but I am. Good. He pulled her closer. Because this is what our life gets to be now. Not fighting or surviving or proving anything. Just living. Just living, Evelyn echoed. I think I can manage that. Yeah? Yeah, with you. Anyway. They danced until the stars came out and the party finally began winding down. People drifted away in twos and threes, calling out final congratulations and well wishes. Clara and Frank were the last to leave, Clara fussing over cleanup until Evelyn gently but firmly sent her home. Finally, it was just Evelyn and Caleb standing in the meadow, surrounded by the debris of their celebration. The candles in their mason jars had burned down to stubs. The flowers on the arch were wilting slightly in the evening warmth. It was perfect. Come on, Caleb said, taking her hand. Let's go home. They walked back to the house together in comfortable silence. Evelyn was exhausted, but in the best possible way, the kind of tired that came from a day well lived rather than a day survived. Inside, Caleb banked the fire while Evelyn changed out of the wedding dress into something more comfortable. When she came back downstairs, he was waiting with 2 glasses of whiskey. To us, he said, handing her one. To us, Evelyn agreed, and they drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, the kind that warmed from the inside out. I have something for you, Caleb said. He disappeared into the other room and came back with a small wooden box. It's not much, but Evelyn opened the box and found a ring. Simple gold, no stones, just a plain band with something engraved inside. She tilted it to catch the light and read the words, "Always stay." It's from what I said in court, Caleb explained, about people staying. I had Tom Brady make it for me. It's perfect. Evelyn's voice came out rough. Help me put it on? He slid the ring onto her finger, the left hand this time, the traditional place. It fit perfectly. like it had been made for her, which she supposed it had been. "I didn't get you anything," she said. "You gave me everything I needed the day you asked me to marry you." Caleb pulled her close. "Everything else is just bonus." They stood in the kitchen holding each other, and Evelyn felt something inside her finally, fully relax. The constant vigilance she'd maintained for months, years really, finally eased. She was safe. She was home. She was loved. And she'd fought like hell to get here. Summer rolled into fall with the kind of golden abundance that made ranchers grateful. The cattle fattened on rich pasture grass. The vegetable garden produced more than they could eat. The repairs they'd made to the property held through the occasional storm. Evelyn caught herself humming while she worked one day and stopped, startled. She couldn't remember the last time she'd hummed. Couldn't remember the last time she'd felt light enough for music. Caleb noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "Happy?" he asked. "Yeah," Evelyn said, testing out the word. "I think I am." "Good. About time." It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. They had their first real fight in August when Caleb wanted to expand the herd and Evelyn worried they couldn't afford the risk. The argument lasted 2 days and ended with them both admitting the other had valid points and finding a compromise. "This is what marriage actually looks like," Caleb said afterward. "Not the romantic stuff from the wedding. This, arguing about cattle and money and risk management. I can live with this." "Me too." In late September, Evelyn realized her monthly cycle was late. At first she dismissed it. Stress could do strange things to a body, and she'd been under more stress than usual between the harvest and preparing for winter. But when another week passed, she started to wonder. She didn't say anything to Caleb. Not yet. Not until she was sure. But she caught herself putting her hand to her stomach sometimes, wondering. The confirmation came in early October when the nausea started. Evelyn spent 3 mornings in a row barely making it outside before losing her breakfast. On the 3rd morning, Caleb followed her out and held her hair back while she was sick. "How long has this been happening?" he asked quietly. "Few days." "And you didn't think to mention it?" Evelyn wiped her mouth and sat back on her heels. "I wasn't sure. I'm still not completely sure. It could be something else." "Evelyn?" Caleb's hand found her shoulder. "When was your last monthly?" "End of August, I think." "It's October." "I know." They looked at each other, and Evelyn saw her own mix of terror and hope reflected in Caleb's expression. "We should see the doctor," he said. "Probably." "Are you scared?" "Terrified." Evelyn let him help her to her feet. "Are you?" "Yeah." He pulled her into his arms carefully, like she might break. "But also excited. Is that allowed?" "I don't know what's allowed." She leaned against him. "I just know that if I am pregnant, I want this baby. With you. I want all of it." The doctor confirmed it a week later. Evelyn was about 6 weeks along, due sometime in late May or early June. Everything looked healthy, though the doctor warned her to take it easy and avoid heavy lifting. "Fat chance of that," Evelyn muttered as they left the doctor's office. "You're going to have to slow down," Caleb said firmly. "Doctor's orders." "I'm pregnant, not broken." "I know, but humor me anyway." They fought about it for a few days, Evelyn insisting she could do everything she'd always done, Caleb insisting she needed to be careful. Finally, they reached a compromise. Evelyn would keep working, but she'd accept help more readily and wouldn't push herself to exhaustion. "I hate being treated like I'm fragile," she grumbled. "You're not fragile. You're carrying our child." Caleb put his hand on her still flat stomach. "Let me worry about you. It's one of my favorite things." Evelyn softened despite herself. "One of your favorite things?" "Right up there with watching you talk to the cattle and finding you asleep over the account books." "I don't fall asleep over the books." "You did last week. Woke up with ink on your face." She had to laugh at that. "Fine. You can worry about me. A little." "I'll take a little." Winter came early that year, snow falling in mid-November and blanketing the ranch in white. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window as Caleb worked outside, bundled against the cold, moving with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Her husband, the father of her child, the man who'd said yes to a desperate proposal and somehow made it into something beautiful. She put her hand on her stomach where a new life was growing. A child who would never doubt they were wanted. Who would grow up on this land with two parents who'd fight to give them every opportunity? The thought made her throat tight. "You all right?" Caleb asked, coming inside with snow in his hair and cold radiating off his coat. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" "About how none of this was supposed to happen. I was supposed to marry you, save the ranch, and eventually divorce. That was the plan." "Plans change." He kicked off his boots and crossed to where she stood. "Better this way?" "So much better." Evelyn turned to face him. "I never believed in happy endings. Thought they were fairy tales people told themselves to feel better about how hard life is. And now I'm living in one. And it's terrifying because happy endings can turn into sad middles real fast if you're not careful." Caleb pulled her close, and she felt the reassuring solidity of him. "Then we'll be careful. We'll protect this. Whatever it takes. Promise?" "Promise." They stood in the kitchen holding each other while the snow fell outside. Two people who'd entered into a fake marriage and built something real from the rubble of their broken expectations. The pregnancy progressed through winter with relatively few complications. Evelyn's body changed in ways that fascinated and occasionally horrified her. Caleb watched it all with something like awe, his hand finding her growing belly whenever they were close. "It moved," he said one January evening, his palm pressed to her stomach. "I felt it move." "That's because they never stop moving. Kid's going to be as restless as you are." "Me? You're the one who can't sit still." "Fair point." Evelyn covered his hand with hers. "We need to pick names." "Already have some in mind?" "Maybe. For a girl, I was thinking Emma, if that's okay." Caleb's expression went soft. "You'd name her after my daughter?" "She was yours. She deserves to be remembered." "Emma Ryder." He tried it out. "I like it. What about for a boy?" "I was thinking James, your middle name." "And if you want to honor your father?" "My father's name was Robert. That can be the middle name either way." Evelyn smiled. "Emma Robert Ryder or James Robert Ryder?" "Perfect." Caleb kissed her forehead. "Absolutely perfect." Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts as the weather couldn't quite decide what season it wanted to be. By late April, Evelyn was enormous and uncomfortable and counting down the days until she could meet this child who'd been kicking her ribs for months. "I'm ready for this to be over," she told Clara during one of the older woman's frequent visits. "You say that now. Wait until you're not sleeping because the baby's crying every 2 hours. At least then I'll be able to see my feet again." The baby came in mid-May, 2 weeks earlier than the doctor predicted. Evelyn's water broke while she was hanging laundry, a moment of panic followed by Caleb rushing to get the doctor while Clara stayed with her and tried to keep her calm. The labor was long and difficult. Evelyn had always known childbirth wouldn't be easy, but knowing it and experiencing it were different things entirely. She spent hours in pain that made delivering a stuck calf seem like nothing, Caleb holding her hand and murmuring encouragement that she mostly couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only 12 hours, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that made Evelyn laugh and cry at the same time. "Emma," the doctor said, placing the tiny, squalling bundle on Evelyn's chest. "You have a daughter." Evelyn looked down at the red-faced, angry little creature and felt something in her chest crack open. Love so fierce it was almost painful. Protection so absolute she'd fight off the entire world to keep this child safe. "She's perfect," Caleb said, his voice rough. He touched Emma's tiny hand with one finger, and she immediately grabbed hold. "Look at that grip, going to be strong like her mother." "Stubborn like her father," Evelyn countered. They sat together in the early morning light, this new family of 3, and Evelyn thought about how far they'd come. From a desperate proposal in a feed store to this. A child they'd made together, wanted together, would raise together. The first few weeks were exhausting. Emma had excellent lungs and used them frequently, especially at night. Evelyn stumbled through her days in a haze of sleeplessness, learning how to feed and change and soothe a tiny human who seemed determined to ensure her parents never rested again. But there were moments of pure joy, too. The first time Emma smiled at her, the way she'd calmed down when Caleb held her against his chest and hummed. The feeling of absolute rightness when Evelyn held her daughter and looked around at the ranch she'd fought so hard to keep. This was what she'd been fighting for all along, even when she didn't know it. Not just the land, but the life that land made possible. The family she could build here. The future she could give her daughter. One evening in early June, when Emma was 3 weeks old, Evelyn stood on the porch with her sleeping daughter in her arms. Caleb came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist. "You know what today is?" he asked. "Tuesday? 1 year since you proposed to me." Evelyn looked at him in surprise. "Has it really been a year?" 365 days since you walked into that feed store and changed both our lives." 365 days, Evelyn repeated. "Seems longer. Seems like you've always been here." "Feel that way to me too." Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best year of my life." "Even with the court case and Holloway and all the drama?" "Even with all that. Because it led here, to you and me and her." He gestured to Emma. "This is what I meant when I said some things are worth fighting for." Evelyn looked out at the ranch spread before them, the fields green with summer growth, the mountains rising solid in the distance, the cattle settling for the evening, her father's land, her mother's memory, her daughter's inheritance. But more than that, it was home, the place where she'd learned that survival wasn't the same as living, that walls built to keep pain out also kept joy out, that sometimes the scariest thing you could do was trust someone enough to let them in. "I'm glad I asked you," she said quietly. "Even though I was terrified, even though I thought it was temporary. I'm glad it was you." "Me too." Caleb held her closer. "And I'm glad I said yes before you even finished asking." Emma stirred in Evelyn's arms and made a small noise before settling back to sleep. Such a tiny person, but already she'd changed everything. Made Evelyn think about the future in ways she never had before. Made her want to build something that would last beyond her own lifetime. "She's going to grow up different than I did," Evelyn said. "She'll never have to marry someone to keep her land, never have to choose between her independence and her security." "Because you fought to change it." "We fought to change it." "Still taking credit for yourself," Caleb teased gently, "after all this time." "Old habits," Evelyn smiled. "But you're right. We did it together. Everything. Saving the ranch, fighting Holloway, building this life. None of it would have worked if I'd tried to do it alone." "Probably would have worked," Caleb said. "You're the most stubborn person I know, but it wouldn't have been as good." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It wouldn't have been as good." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The same sky Evelyn had watched her entire life, but somehow it looked different now. Brighter, maybe. Or maybe she was just finally letting herself see the beauty instead of only watching for storms. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. "Everything. How a year ago I was convinced my life was ending because I couldn't keep the ranch alone. How I thought marrying you was a last resort, a desperate measure." She shifted Emma carefully. "And how it turned out to be the first real choice I made, not for survival, but for actually living. Took you a while to figure that out." "I'm stubborn, remember?" Evelyn looked at him. "But I got there eventually, with your help. That's all anyone can really do. Help each other figure it out as we go." Inside the house, Evelyn could see the lamp they'd left burning in the kitchen. The same kitchen where they'd sat across from each other planning a fake marriage. The same table where they'd worked out the details of their arrangement. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. They'd changed. Emma started fussing, and Evelyn recognized the early signs that meant hungry. "I should feed her." "I'll make dinner while you do," Caleb said. "We've got that beef stew from yesterday." Such ordinary words, such ordinary plans. But that was what life was made of. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Feeding the baby, making dinner, working the land, falling asleep tangled together, and waking up to do it all again. Evelyn had spent so long bracing for disaster that she'd almost missed the miracle happening right in front of her. Later that night, after Emma had been fed and changed and finally settled in her cradle, after they'd eaten dinner and cleaned up and completed all the small tasks that made up a life, Evelyn and Caleb lay in bed together. "Do you ever wonder how things would have turned out if I'd asked someone else?" Evelyn asked. "If you'd said no?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted, "but not in a useful way. All I know is I'm grateful it worked out like this." "Me too." She rolled toward him, resting her head on his shoulder. Through the open window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, cattle settling, the wind in the pines, Somewhere in the distance, a coyote calling. All the sounds of home. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you. For what? For saying yes. For staying. For making me believe that not everyone leaves. His arm tightened around her. Always stay. Remember? I remember. Evelyn touched the ring on her finger, the one engraved with those exact words. I remember everything. They drifted toward sleep in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other well enough that words weren't always necessary. And as Evelyn felt herself slipping away, she thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, desperate, afraid, convinced she had to face everything alone. That woman would barely recognize the person she'd become, would probably scoff at the idea that a fake marriage could turn into something real, would never believe that the biggest risk she ever took would turn out to be the best decision of her life. But it had. She'd walked into a feed store planning to save her ranch and walked out having saved herself instead. Not that she'd known it at the time, not that she'd even been looking to be saved. But Caleb had seen past the walls she'd built and offered her something she didn't know she needed: partnership, genuine, honest partnership with someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. And from that partnership had grown everything else: love and trust and a family and a future she could actually let herself imagine. Outside, Emma started crying. Evelyn groaned and started to get up, but Caleb was already moving. I've got her, he said. You sleep. You sure? I'm sure. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. You rest. I'll take this shift. Evelyn listened to him cross to the nursery, heard his low voice soothing their daughter, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it made her throat tight. This was what she'd fought for. This exact moment. A partner who showed up, who shared the burden, who made the hard days bearable and the good days better. She fell asleep listening to Caleb singing to Emma, some old song she didn't recognize, his voice rough but gentle. The sound of home, the sound of family, the sound of everything she'd never let herself hope for finally, improbably, coming true. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains and painted the valley gold, Evelyn Ryder would wake up in the house her father built, surrounded by the people she loved, on the land she'd fought to keep. She'd wake up to another ordinary day of feeding cattle and fixing fences and raising a daughter and building a life with a man she'd married for all the wrong reasons and loved for all the right ones. She'd wake up knowing that some fairy tales start in feed stores, that some happy endings come from desperate proposals, and that sometimes the strongest things aren't built through force at all. They're built slowly, through patience and loyalty and the quiet courage of someone who stays. Someone who always stays.